I had been planning this hike for weeks. The idea was simple. Take a few days off from work, head into the wilderness, and spend some time alone in nature. I needed to clear my head, and hiking in the mountains was the best way to do it. The trail I picked was one I'd heard about from a few hikers online. It wasn't well known, which made it all the more appealing to me. I liked the idea of being away from crowds, off the beaten path. It was early in the morning when I parked my car at the trailhead, just as the sun began to rise. The air was fresh, cool, and still. I could hear the rustle of leaves as a light breeze stirred through the trees. There was something calming about the quiet of the mountains before the day truly started. I could already tell that this trip was going to be different from any I had done before. The trail started off easy enough. A smooth, well-trodden path wound through dense woods, and I made steady progress as I walked. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional bird call and the crunch of fallen leaves beneath my boots. As I hiked, I let my thoughts wander. I wasn't in a rush, and I wanted to take in the surroundings. The towering trees, the scent of pine, the cool, crisp air. After a few hours of hiking, I came to a small stream that ran alongside the trail. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was soothing, and I decided to stop and rest for a while. I sat on a large, flat rock near the stream, taking out some water and a few snacks. As I relaxed, I noticed how peaceful the place was. No signs of other people, just me and the wilderness. But as I sat there, something felt a little off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the trees loomed above me, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. Or perhaps it was the stillness of the place, the way the birds and insects had suddenly gone quiet. The hair on the back of my neck stood up slightly, but I shook it off. It was probably nothing. I wasn't used to being this deep in the woods on my own. I packed up my things and continued on the trail. As the day wore on, the path began to get steeper. The trees thinned out, and I found myself climbing up rocky slopes, my boots slipping on loose gravel as I struggled to keep my footing. The climb was harder than I expected, but I welcomed the challenge. The higher I went, the more I felt a sense of isolation, of being completely removed from the world I had left behind at the trailhead. At some point, I reached the top of a ridge and stopped to catch my breath. I looked out across the valley below. The view was breathtaking, the mountains in the distance, the forest stretching out endlessly in every direction. It was beautiful, but there was a certain emptiness to it as well. No signs of life, no other hikers, nothing but the wilderness. I decided to push on, following a narrower, less defined trail that seemed to curve around the mountain. The further I went, the more the path began to fade. It became harder to follow, and I had to watch my step more carefully. The trail seemed to climb higher and higher, winding through thick brush and dense thickets of trees. I wasn't sure where I was heading anymore. It wasn't that I was lost. I still had my map and compass, but the trail felt more like an afterthought, as if it hadn't been maintained in years. It wasn't long before I started to feel like something was wrong. The air had grown thicker, heavier, and the forest had taken on an oppressive, almost suffocating quality. The trees were more closely packed now, and I noticed that they were all older, twisted, and gnarled. They blocked out the sky above, casting the area in deep shadow. My footsteps were the only sound, echoing eerily in the quiet woods. I stopped for a moment, taking a look around. That strange feeling of unease was back, stronger this time. The feeling of being watched, like I wasn't truly alone in the forest. It made no sense. I was a seasoned hiker, used to the wilderness, used to solitude. I'd hiked alone before without any problems. But something about this place felt different, unnerving, almost suffocating. I tried to push the feeling away and continued walking. The trail was becoming more and more difficult to follow now. It seemed to split off in multiple directions, like the path was becoming less and less defined the further I went. I found myself climbing over rocks and scrambling through dense underbrush, my clothes getting snagged on branches. The path was narrowing, and it felt like I was venturing into a part of the forest where few people had been before. By late afternoon, I had lost track of time. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. I still hadn't found a good place to camp, and the thought of continuing on into the wilderness any further didn't sit well with me. I'd heard enough stories about people getting lost, wandering off the trail, or getting trapped in the woods. It was a reality I didn't want to face. I started to retrace my steps, hoping to find a better place to camp, but the trail I had been following seemed to disappear altogether. The trees had become so dense that I couldn't see the way forward. The underbrush was thick, and the ground was uneven. I had been hiking for hours, and it felt like I had gone in a circle, like the forest was playing tricks on me. My heart began to race as the daylight continued to fade. I decided to stop and set up camp for the night. I found a small clearing and quickly pitched my tent. I didn't feel safe venturing any further. I made a small fire, its light flickering in the growing darkness, but the warmth did little to comfort me. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and making the branches creak and groan above me. I stayed close to the fire, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The night was long. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder, more intense. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the firelight. I kept imagining eyes watching me from the darkness, the rustle of leaves just a little too loud, the sound of footsteps I couldn't quite place. By morning, I was exhausted. I packed up my camp and prepared to leave, hoping to find the trail again. The air was colder now, and the sun was still low in the sky, barely breaking through the thick canopy above. I followed what I hoped was the path, but the forest seemed to have changed overnight. The trees were closer together, the underbrush thicker. The trail had become nearly impossible to follow. As I pushed through the forest, I stumbled upon something strange. A small stone cairn, stacked neatly by the side of the trail. I couldn't remember seeing it the day before, and it was too perfectly arranged to have been made by an animal. It sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what to make of it, but it felt like a sign that I had wandered into a part of the forest I shouldn't have been in. I decided then that I needed to get out, that I had spent too much time in the woods. I needed to find the trailhead and leave before I got myself into real trouble. But the further I went, the more lost I became. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and I couldn't find my way back. My sense of direction had completely failed me. Just as panic started to set in, I spotted something in the distance, a small break in the trees. I pushed through the brush, my heart pounding, and finally emerged into a clearing. And there, not far away, was the trail I had been looking for. I had somehow stumbled upon it in the nick of time. I followed the trail back down the mountain, my legs sore from the strain, my mind still racing from the tension of the past 24 hours. When I finally reached the parking lot where my car was waiting, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The feeling of being trapped in the forest, the uncertainty, the fear, it was all behind me now. I never went back to that trail. I learned a lot about myself that day, about my limits, about trusting my instincts, and about the unpredictable nature of the wilderness. It's a place of beauty and danger, and it doesn't always give you a second chance. But I made it out, and that's what mattered. I've hiked many trails since then, but I never forget the feeling of being lost in that forest, of realizing just how easy it is to disappear without a trace. The mountains can be unforgiving, and sometimes the wilderness doesn't care if you're prepared. But I made it out. That's the important thing. and I would never take the outdoors for granted again. I've always loved the outdoors. For me, hiking is a way to escape the stress of daily life, to feel small beneath towering trees, and to push my limits. But one hike last summer taught me that nature can be as terrifying as it is beautiful. This story isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about how easily things can go wrong when you're alone in the wilderness. I decided to take a solo trip to the national park near my hometown. It was a popular destination with well-marked trails and a steady stream of hikers. But I'd planned a route that would take me away from the crowded paths and deep into the backcountry. I'd spent weeks preparing, reading maps, checking weather forecasts, and making sure my gear was in good condition. I felt confident, even excited. The first day of the hike went smoothly. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and a cool breeze. The trail was challenging but manageable, winding through dense forests and along the edges of steep ridges. I took my time, stopping to admire the views and snap photos of wildflowers. By late afternoon, I'd reached a secluded clearing where I set up camp for the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove and watched the sky turn shades of orange and pink. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. The second day started just as well. I packed up camp and set off early, eager to cover more ground. The trail grew narrower and less defined as I moved deeper into the backcountry. I'd chosen this route because it promised solitude and untouched beauty, and it delivered. Towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction, their needles creating a soft carpet underfoot. The air smelled of earth and resin, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Around midday, I reached a small stream where I refilled my water bottles and took a break. I sat on a flat rock, soaking my tired feet in the cool water and enjoying the quiet. It was the kind of moment that made all the effort worthwhile. But as I packed up and prepared to move on, I noticed something that gave me pause. A set of footprints crossed the stream and disappeared into the woods on the other side. They weren't mine and they didn't look fresh. I wasn't alarmed at first. The park was open to everyone, and it wasn't unusual to come across signs of other hikers, even in the more remote areas. Still, the tracks were odd. They were deep, as if the person had been carrying a heavy load, and they veered off the trail into dense undergrowth. I tried to dismiss it as none of my business and continued on my way. The trail grew steeper and more challenging as the day went on. By mid-afternoon, I was sweating and out of breath. I reached a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the valley below and decided it was a good spot to rest. I pulled out a granola bar and took a long drink from my water bottle, feeling the satisfaction of a hard day's hike. But then I noticed something that set my nerves on edge. Below me, in the valley, was a thin column of smoke rising into the air. It wasn't a forest fire, the smoke was too controlled for that. It looked like someone had built a campfire. Normally, this wouldn't have bothered me, but combined with the strange footprints I'd seen earlier, it made me uneasy. This area was supposed to be uninhabited, far from any established campsites or trails. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to investigate to see who else was out here. Maybe it was just another hiker, someone who'd gotten lost or decided to set up camp early. But another part of me, a louder, more insistent part, told me to keep moving. I wasn't in the mood to take unnecessary risks. I continued on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But the unease lingered, a constant weight in the back of my mind. By the time I set up camp that evening, I was exhausted. I chose a spot near a small, stagnant pond, hidden from the trail by a dense thicket of bushes. It wasn't the most picturesque campsite, but it felt safe. I cooked a quick meal and crawled into my tent as soon as the sun went down. Despite my fatigue, I found it hard to sleep. Every little noise outside, the rustling of leaves, the croak of a frog, seemed magnified in the silence of the night. I kept imagining someone creeping through the woods, just out of sight. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. At first, I didn't know what had startled me. The woods were silent, eerily so. No wind, no insects, nothing. I lay still, straining my ears for any sound. And then I heard it. A faint, deliberate crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My blood ran cold. The sound was close, too close. Whoever it was, they weren't on the trail. They were moving through the undergrowth, heading straight for my campsite. I didn't have a weapon, just a small knife I used for cutting rope and opening food packets. My mind raced as I tried to decide what to do. Should I stay hidden and hope they passed by? Or should I confront them, make it clear I wasn't an easy target? The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, clutching the knife in my shaking hand. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up and left the campsite as quickly as I could. I wanted to believe it had been an animal, maybe a deer or a curious raccoon. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps had been too deliberate, too human. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to civilization. The trail I'd been following looped around to connect with a more popular route, and I figured I could reach it by midday. But as I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. The woods, once so peaceful, now felt oppressive and menacing. By late morning, I reached a fork in the trail where a weathered sign pointed the way to the main route. Relief washed over me. I wasn't far from safety now, but as I started down the new path, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Carved into the wooden sign, deep and jagged, were the words, "Leave now." My heart pounded as I stared at the crude warning. It looked fresh, the edges of the letters still raw and splintered. I didn't stick around to investigate. I picked up my pace, practically jogging down the trail. The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows long and dark despite the midday sun. Every step felt like a race against unseen danger. When I finally emerged onto the main trail, I nearly cried with relief. The wide, well-trodden path felt like a lifeline, a promise of safety. I passed a few other hikers along the way, their friendly smiles and casual greetings a stark contrast to the fear that still gripped me. I wanted to tell them what had happened, to warn them about the footprints, the smoke, the carved warning. But I didn't. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound paranoid? I reached the trailhead by late afternoon and drove straight home without stopping. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside my window, sent my heart racing. I've tried to make sense of what happened out there, to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it was just another hiker, someone who wanted solitude as much as I did. Maybe the warning was meant for someone else. Or maybe I'll never know. I still love hiking, but I've been more cautious since that trip. I stick to well-traveled trails and always let someone know where I'm going. Nature is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes, it reminds you just how vulnerable you really are. The plan was simple, a solo hike to clear my head. I had a stressful month at work, and getting out into nature seemed like the perfect escape. I chose a trail I'd read about online, a long but manageable loop through a remote forest. It wasn't popular, which was part of the appeal. I wanted solitude, a break from emails and meetings. I packed my essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, and a lightweight tent in case I decided to camp overnight. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, but as I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the parking lot, I felt the first twinge of unease. The road was barely wide enough for my car, with steep drop-offs on one side and dense forest on the other. The parking area was empty except for a single rusty pickup truck parked in the far corner. Its windows were fogged up, and there was no sign of the driver. I shrugged it off, probably someone who'd started their hike earlier in the morning. The trail started out wide and well-maintained, winding gently uphill through towering pines. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird call. After about an hour, the trail narrowed and became more rugged. I'd read that this section was less maintained, but the markers were still visible, so I pressed on. By midday, I reached a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. I sat down on a flat rock, pulled out a sandwich, and took a long drink from my water bottle. The solitude was everything I'd hoped for. No cell service, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I lingered for a while, then packed up and continued on. The trail descended into a dense forest where the sunlight barely reached the ground. The air felt cooler, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I checked my map frequently, making sure I stayed on the loop trail. The markers were farther apart here, but they were still there, faint splashes of paint on tree trunks. Around mid-afternoon, I came across an old, weathered sign pointing to a side trail. The lettering was faded, but I could just make out the words, "Scenic Overlook." It wasn't on my map, but curiosity got the better of me. The side trail was narrower and steeper, winding uphill through thick underbrush. It was clear no one had maintained it in years. Branches scratched at my arms, and I had to duck under fallen trees. After about 20 minutes, I began to regret my decision. The trail seemed to go on forever, and there was no sign of the overlook. I was about to turn back when I spotted a clearing up ahead. The view was worth the detour. I could see for miles. Rolling hills, dense forests, and a glimmer of water in the distance that must have been a lake. I stood there for a while, letting the wind cool my sweat-soaked face. But as I turned to head back, I realized I hadn't been paying attention to the trail. The way back wasn't obvious, and I couldn't see the faint path I'd followed earlier. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I pulled out my map and tried to orient myself. The side trail wasn't marked, but I knew the general direction of the main loop. If I kept heading downhill, I should eventually intersect it. The forest felt different on the way down. Shadows stretched longer, and the underbrush seemed denser. I stumbled over roots and slipped on loose rocks. My legs were beginning to ache, and my water bottle was nearly empty. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint trail marker ahead. Relief washed over me as I realized I'd found the main loop. I checked my watch. It was later than I'd thought, and the light was fading fast. I still had a couple of miles to go before I'd be back at the trailhead. I picked up my pace, but the trail seemed more overgrown than I remembered. Branches snagged at my clothes, and the underbrush scraped my legs. I told myself it was just the growing darkness making everything look unfamiliar. Then I saw it, a pile of rocks in the middle of the trail. It hadn't been there earlier. It wasn't just a random scatter. It was a deliberate stack, like a cairn. I stopped and stared at it, my heart pounding. Who had placed it there, and why? I hadn't seen another hiker all day. I stepped around the rocks and kept moving, my senses on high alert. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. The trail markers were harder to spot now, and I had to backtrack several times to find them. The forest seemed darker, denser, as if it were closing in around me. I came across another cairn, then another. Each one was more elaborate than the last, with sticks and moss woven into the structure. They were unsettling, but I didn't have time to dwell on them. The light was almost gone, and I needed to get back to the car. Finally, I saw the faint glow of the parking lot through the trees. Relief flooded me as I stumbled onto the gravel and made my way to my car. The rusty pickup truck was still there, but the windows were no longer fogged up. The interior was dark, and I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. I didn't stick around to find out. I unlocked my car, threw my pack into the back seat, and got in. As I started the engine, my headlights illuminated the edge of the forest. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. They were motionless, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette against the dark trees. My hands trembled as I shifted into reverse and backed out of the parking lot. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Who had built the cairns? Who had been watching me? And why? I told myself it was just my imagination, that I'd let the isolation and darkness play tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When I got home, I locked every door and window and double-checked them before going to bed. I wanted to believe I'd overreacted, that it was just an ordinary hike with a few strange coincidences. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there, and I'm not sure I ever want to go hiking again. It was early autumn when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the woods near my hometown. The air was crisp, and the leaves were just starting to change, painting the landscape with patches of orange, yellow, and red. I needed a break from the daily grind, and the thought of a quiet weekend in nature sounded perfect. I had my tent, sleeping bag, some basic cooking gear, and enough food to last 3 days. Everything was packed neatly into my old hiking backpack. I chose a spot deep in the woods, far away from the usual trails. It wasn't my first time camping alone, so I felt confident navigating through the forest. I parked my car at a small gravel lot that marked the end of a dirt road and began my hike. The trail started off wide and well-maintained, but soon narrowed as I ventured deeper. The further I went, the quieter it became. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of squirrels darting through the underbrush. By the time I reached my chosen campsite, it was mid-afternoon. The spot was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a gentle slope leading down to a stream about 50 yards away. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground and gathered some rocks to build a fire pit. Once everything was in place, I sat down on a fallen log and took in the surroundings. The woods felt alive but calm, the kind of place where you could lose track of time just listening to the wind in the trees. After unpacking and setting up camp, I decided to explore the area before it got dark. I followed the stream for a while, noticing animal tracks in the soft mud along its banks. Deer, raccoons, and even a set of larger tracks that looked like they belonged to a bear. They weren't fresh, so I didn't worry too much, but I made a mental note to keep my food stored properly. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I made my way back to camp, collected some firewood, and started a small fire. Dinner was simple: a can of chili heated over the flames and some bread I'd brought along. As I ate, the woods began to change. The daytime sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant yip of a coyote. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the trees around me. It felt both peaceful and slightly unsettling, a reminder that I was alone out here, far from anyone who could help if something went wrong. I stayed up for a while, staring into the flames and enjoying the solitude. Eventually, I doused the fire, zipped myself into my tent, and settled into my sleeping bag. The night was colder than I'd expected, and I found myself shivering a little despite the layers I was wearing. I fell asleep listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The woods were silent, almost unnaturally so. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. I lay there for a moment, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. That's when I noticed it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was distant but distinct, coming from the direction of the stream. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sound didn't seem random. It was deliberate, steady, and getting closer. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any noise. My flashlight was within arm's reach, but I hesitated to grab it. Part of me didn't want to see what was out there. The footsteps stopped. For a few seconds, there was silence again, and I started to wonder if I'd imagined it. Then, a new sound broke the stillness. A low, guttural grunt. It was deep and unnatural, not like any animal I'd heard before. My skin crawled, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. I fumbled for the flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam toward the direction of the noise. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The sound had stopped. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, listening and scanning the woods with the flashlight. Finally, I convinced myself that whatever it was had moved on. I lay back down, my heart still pounding, and tried to calm myself. Sleep didn't come easily, and I spent the rest of the night waking up at the slightest noise. The next morning, I emerged from the tent to find the campsite undisturbed. The woods looked normal again, bathed in soft morning light. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before as I made breakfast and planned my day. Maybe it really had been just an animal, and I'd let my imagination get the better of me. I decided to spend the day hiking and exploring, hoping to distract myself. I packed a small day bag with water and snacks and set off in a direction I hadn't explored yet. The forest was dense but beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and dappling the ground. I followed a faint trail that seemed to lead uphill, eventually reaching a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the valley below. For a while, I felt at ease again, enjoying the beauty and solitude of the wilderness. On the way back to camp, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints, faint but visible in the soft earth, crossing the trail I was on. They were human footprints, larger than mine, and headed in the direction of my campsite. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen anyone else out here, and this was supposed to be a remote area. I told myself it could be an old trail, the prints left by someone who'd passed through days ago. But they looked fresh. When I got back to camp, everything seemed untouched. My tent was still there, and my gear was undisturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the afternoon close to camp, gathering more firewood and keeping an eye on my surroundings. Every so often, I'd hear a rustling noise or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but I could never pinpoint the source. As the sun began to set, I built up the fire higher than the night before, hoping it would deter any curious animals or unwelcome visitors. I ate dinner quickly and kept my flashlight and a sturdy stick within reach. The sense of unease was growing, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent, fully clothed, listening for any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer, circling the perimeter of my campsite. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight and stick tightly. The footsteps paused, then started again, moving closer to the tent. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. Suddenly, the sound stopped right outside the tent. I could hear breathing, low and steady. My mind raced, trying to decide what to do. If it was a person, confronting them could be dangerous. If it wasn't, well, I didn't want to think about that. I stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe until the sound of footsteps started again, moving away this time. When I finally heard them fade into the distance, I forced myself to wait another hour before daring to move. At first light, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something watching me from the trees. The hike back to my car was the longest of my life. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. When I finally reached the gravel lot and saw my car, relief washed over me. I threw my gear into the back, started the engine, and didn't look back as I drove away. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. Part of me wants to believe it was just another camper who stumbled upon my site by accident, but the way they moved and the sounds they made didn't feel right. I haven't been camping alone since. I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up, my family spent summers camping in the mountains, and those memories of starry nights and the smell of pine trees stayed with me as I got older. A few months ago, I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and I needed some time away from the noise of the city. I chose a remote area in the national forest, far from the usual crowded campgrounds. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape. Instead, it turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I planned carefully. My gear was in good shape, and I had a reliable tent, a warm sleeping bag, and enough food and water for 4 days. I packed a map, a compass, and a GPS, though I prided myself on being able to navigate without relying too much on technology. The trail I'd chosen was marked on the map, but it wasn't heavily trafficked. That was part of the appeal, the chance to be truly alone in nature. The first day went as planned. I parked my car at the trailhead, hoisted my backpack, and started walking. The forest was beautiful, the air crisp and clean. The trail wound through towering pines and thick undergrowth, occasionally opening up to reveal stunning views of distant mountains. I felt my stress melting away with each step. By late afternoon, I'd found a good spot to set up camp near a small stream. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun set, the forest grew quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. It was exactly what I'd been hoping for. The second day was much the same. I spent the morning exploring the area around my campsite, taking in the scenery and snapping a few photos. By afternoon, I decided to hike further up the trail to see where it led. I kept my backpack light, carrying just some water, a snack, and my map. The trail became steeper and less defined as I climbed, but I wasn't worried. I had my bearings, and I could always retrace my steps if needed. It was late afternoon when I noticed the first odd thing. I'd been following the trail along a ridgeline when I came across a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was an old, weathered cabin. It wasn't on my map, and I hadn't expected to see any structures out here. The cabin looked abandoned, with its roof sagging and the wood darkened by years of exposure to the elements. Curious, I approached cautiously. There was no path leading to the cabin, just the faint trail I'd been following. It seemed out of place, like it had been forgotten by time. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The interior was dim, with sunlight streaming through gaps in the walls. The cabin was empty except for a broken table and a few rusted tools scattered on the floor. The air smelled musty, and I felt a strange unease. It wasn't fear exactly, but a sense that I didn't belong there. I left quickly, deciding not to linger. The forest felt different as I walked back to my campsite, the shadows longer and the air heavier. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, a reaction to stumbling across something unexpected. I forced myself to relax, focusing on the crackling fire and the familiar sounds of the forest. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell into a restless sleep. The third day started uneventfully. I packed up my gear and decided to continue along the trail, planning to loop back to my car by the end of the day. The unease from the previous evening lingered, but I brushed it off. The forest was dense, the trail barely visible in places, but I was confident in my navigation skills. Around midday, I noticed something strange. Footprints on the trail. They were faint but clearly human, heading in the same direction as me. I hadn't seen anyone since starting my hike, and the trail was too remote for casual hikers. The prints looked fresh, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. I continued walking, keeping an eye out for whoever might have left the footprints. Hours passed, and I saw no one. The trail grew more difficult to follow, overgrown and crisscrossed with fallen branches. By late afternoon, I realized I'd lost the trail entirely. I'd been so focused on the footprints and my surroundings that I'd stopped paying attention to the markers. Frustrated, I pulled out my map and compass, trying to get my bearings. The dense trees made it hard to see any landmarks, but I estimated my location and started heading in what I thought was the right direction. The forest felt oppressive as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. I told myself it was just the natural sounds of the forest, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I kept moving, trying to ignore the growing unease. As dusk approached, I knew I needed to find a place to camp for the night. I came across a small clearing and set up my tent quickly, not bothering with a fire. The silence was unnerving, the usual nighttime sounds of the forest strangely absent. I lay in my tent, listening to my own breathing and the occasional distant sound of something moving through the undergrowth. Sleep was impossible. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. My heart pounded as I lay frozen, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly. Summoning my courage, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. There was no sign of anyone or anything. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I stayed awake, clutching my flashlight and listening for any sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started walking. I didn't care about the trail or my planned route anymore. I just wanted to get back to my car. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The forest seemed to close in around me, every shadow and movement catching my eye. I quickened my pace, ignoring the weight of my pack and the burning in my legs. Hours passed, and I still hadn't found the trailhead. Panic set in as the realization hit me. I was lost. I stopped to catch my breath and consult my map again, but the dense forest made it impossible to pinpoint my location. The GPS had lost signal, and I cursed myself for venturing so far off the trail. As I stood there, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable. They were coming from somewhere behind me. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I started running, adrenaline overriding my exhaustion. The forest blurred around me as I pushed forward, branches snagging my clothes and tearing at my skin. I stumbled and fell more than once, but I didn't stop. The footsteps seemed to follow, always just out of sight. Eventually, I broke through the trees into a clearing. Relief flooded me as I saw a dirt road in the distance. I sprinted toward it, not caring where it led as long as it was away from the forest. When I reached the road, I collapsed, gasping for air. I looked back at the tree line, half expecting to see someone emerge, but there was nothing. I followed the road until I found a ranger station, my legs barely able to carry me. The rangers were concerned but didn't seem surprised when I told them about the footprints and the sounds in the forest. They said the area was known for its remoteness and warned that it was easy to get lost. They offered to help retrieve my car, which was still at the trailhead. I never figured out who or what was out there with me. Maybe it was another hiker, though I can't imagine why they would follow me without making themselves known. Maybe it was my own paranoia playing tricks on me. Either way, I haven't been back to the forest since. The outdoors used to be my escape, but now the thought of being alone in the woods fills me with dread. I still love the mountains and the fresh air, but I've learned that solitude in nature comes with risks I hadn't fully understood before. That trip changed me, and I'm not sure I'll ever feel completely at ease in the wilderness again. The plan was simple: a solo camping trip to escape the noise of everyday life. I'd done it before and always found peace in the solitude of nature. This time, I picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any established campground. It wasn't marked on any popular trail map, just a pin I dropped on my GPS after hours of scrolling satellite views. The kind of place where you could sit in absolute silence and forget the world existed. I packed everything meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, and my trusty camping knife. I left my phone behind, deciding the GPS watch and a paper map would suffice. The less connection to the outside world, the better. My car took me as far as a dirt logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. From there, it was a 4-mile hike to my intended spot. The trek started easy. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves were a patchwork of orange and red, crunching underfoot with every step. The deeper I went, the more alive the forest felt. Birds chirped, squirrels darted up trees, and the faint rustle of wind through the canopy was calming. But the further I got from the road, the quieter it became. By the time I reached my destination, the only sound was the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. The spot was perfect: a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a stream running nearby for water. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and started a small fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I cooked a simple meal, then sat by the flames, staring into the flickering light. The silence was profound. No hum of traffic, no distant voices, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was exactly what I'd wanted. That first night passed uneventfully. I slept well, cocooned in my sleeping bag, and woke to the sound of birds greeting the dawn. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I'd brought a small day pack with some essentials and left the bulk of my gear at the campsite. The terrain was rugged, with uneven ground and dense underbrush, but I enjoyed the challenge. I followed the stream upstream for a while, then veered off to climb a small hill that promised a decent view. At the top, I found an old, rusted hunting stand, half collapsed and overgrown with vines. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. From there, I could see the forest stretching out endlessly in every direction. No roads, no houses, not even a hint of civilization. It was both exhilarating and a little unsettling. Being so completely alone has a way of making you feel both free and vulnerable at the same time. As I descended the hill, I noticed something odd: a faint trail, barely visible, leading deeper into the woods. It wasn't marked on my map, and it didn't look like a game trail. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes disappearing altogether, but I kept at it. About half an hour in, I stumbled across something I wasn't expecting: a campsite. It wasn't like mine, though. This one was old, abandoned for years by the looks of it. The remnants of a tent lay in a tattered heap, its fabric faded and torn. A rusted cooking pot sat near the remains of a fire pit, now just a ring of blackened stones. There were other items, too. A moldy backpack, a pair of boots so worn they'd practically disintegrated. It was eerie. I couldn't help but wonder who had camped here and why they'd left so much behind. I poked around a bit, trying to piece together the story. The site felt wrong somehow. Not just abandoned, but forgotten, like it had been erased from memory. I found no signs of a struggle, no torn fabric, no scattered belongings, just decay and neglect. A sense of unease settled over me, and I decided to head back to my own camp. The walk back felt longer than it should have. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being watched. But each time I stopped and turned around, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. By the time I reached my camp, the sun was low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the clearing. I rekindled my fire, more for comfort than warmth, and ate a quick meal. The unease from earlier hadn't left me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig jolted me awake. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest, but my brain wouldn't let it go. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off, only to be startled awake by a loud noise. It sounded like something heavy falling, followed by a series of rapid, crunching footsteps. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the clearing in dim, flickering light. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the noise had come from close by, too close. I sat there for what felt like hours, straining to hear any hint of movement. Eventually, the forest grew quiet again, and I managed to convince myself it was probably just a deer or a bear. Still, I kept my knife within arm's reach as I tried to get back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints. Not animal tracks, but human ones circling my campsite. They weren't fresh. The edges were slightly blurred, as if they'd been made the day before, but they hadn't been there when I'd set up camp. My stomach churned as I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing, where they disappeared into the woods. Whoever had made them had been watching me. I debated packing up and leaving, but something about the footprints bothered me. They weren't just random, they formed a deliberate pattern, as if whoever made them had been pacing around the camp. It didn't feel like an accident. Against my better judgment, I decided to stay one more night, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That day, I stayed close to camp, gathering firewood and keeping my knife on me at all times. I didn't venture far, not wanting to risk running into whoever had been here. As night fell, I built a larger fire than usual, hoping it would deter any unwanted visitors. The hours dragged by, each one marked by the oppressive silence of the forest. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps. This time, they were deliberate, slow, and methodical. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and knife, but I stayed in the tent, too scared to confront whoever it was. The footsteps stopped just outside, and for a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear and started the hike back to my car. Every step felt heavier than the last, my senses on high alert for any sign of movement. The forest, once peaceful, now felt suffocating. Every shadow looked like a figure, every sound like a threat. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought me to tears. I threw my gear in the back and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about that abandoned campsite and the footprints around my tent. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they were there, and that's what terrifies me the most. Camping had always been my way to unwind. There was something about the quiet woods, the smell of pine, and the crackling of a campfire that made everything feel right. This time, I decided to venture alone. I had always camped with friends, but I wanted to test myself to find out if I could handle the solitude. I picked a spot deep in the forest, far from any marked trails. It was a remote area I had read about in a forum for experienced campers. The spot was supposed to be perfect, untouched, peaceful, and surrounded by nature. I spent a few days preparing, packing my gear carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, flashlight, knife, the usual essentials. The drive to the forest took about 4 hours. By the time I parked my car at the nearest lot and started hiking, the sun was already high in the sky. The trail was rugged and overgrown, but I'd studied the map and felt confident I could navigate. My backpack was heavy, but it felt good, like I was carrying everything I needed to survive. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and chirping of birds. As I ventured deeper, the trail disappeared entirely, just as I had expected. I used my compass and map to guide me, stepping over roots and pushing through thick brush. It was exhausting, but I felt a sense of accomplishment when I finally reached the clearing I had chosen for my campsite. The spot was perfect. A small meadow surrounded by tall trees, with a creek running nearby. The sound of the water was soothing, and the area seemed untouched by other campers. I set up my tent in the center of the clearing, gathered some wood for a fire, and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area. There were no signs of other people. No litter, no trails, no remnants of old campsites. It was exactly what I wanted. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit my fire and cooked a simple meal of canned beans and bread. The firelight danced on the trees, casting long shadows that swayed with the flickering flames. I felt a mix of excitement and unease. Being completely alone in the wilderness was thrilling, but it also meant there was no one to turn to if something went wrong. The first night was uneventful. I woke up a few times, startled by noises outside my tent, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but I told myself it was just animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear, though I had taken precautions to store my food away from my tent. By morning, the noises were forgotten, and I felt more confident. The second day, I decided to explore further. I followed the creek downstream, curious to see where it led. The terrain was rough, with steep hills and dense underbrush, but I enjoyed the challenge. Around midday, I found an old, overgrown trail. It wasn't on my map, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. Intrigued, I followed it. The trail wound through the forest, leading me to a small clearing with the remnants of an old cabin. It was little more than a pile of rotting wood, barely recognizable as a structure. Curious, I poked around, finding rusted tools and broken glass. It was clear no one had been here in decades. Something about the place felt off, though. The air was heavier, the woods quieter. I decided not to linger and made my way back to my campsite. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was irrational, I told myself. The woods were vast and empty, but the hairs on the back of my neck wouldn't settle. I kept glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight, half expecting to see something or someone. Staring back, when I finally crawled into my tent, I made sure to zip it up tightly. I lay there in the dark, listening. The usual forest sounds were there, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. But there were other noises too. Faint, distant sounds that I couldn't quite identify. A soft rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. A faint thud, like something heavy being dropped. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was spooking myself. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to total silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know why. I listened, straining to hear anything, but the woods were unnaturally quiet. Then I heard it, a single, sharp snap of a twig, close to my tent. Too close. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? Maybe, but it sounded deliberate, like a footstep. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal and forced myself to relax. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Around my campsite, in the soft dirt, were footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, and the tread didn't match my boots. Whoever had made them had walked around my tent, then disappeared back into the woods. I packed up my camp quickly, my hands shaking. I wanted to leave, but I was deep in the forest, miles from my car. Hiking out would take all day, and I wasn't sure I could navigate back to the trailhead without making mistakes. I decided to move my camp closer to the creek, where the terrain was more open. I didn't want to be surrounded by trees anymore. The day passed slowly. I kept looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. The woods felt different now, less peaceful, more oppressive. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I set up my new camp, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I ate a cold dinner, then crawled into my tent and zipped it up tightly. I kept my knife and flashlight within reach. Sleep didn't come easily. Every noise outside made my heart race. I kept imagining someone standing just outside my tent, waiting. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my tent. My mouth went dry, and I gripped my knife so tightly my hand hurt. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving away. I lay there, too scared to move, until the first light of dawn. When I finally unzipped my tent, the campsite was empty. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no disturbed leaves. But I knew what I had heard. I didn't waste any time packing up. I stuffed everything into my backpack haphazardly and started hiking back toward my car. The hike out was the longest of my life. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. The forest seemed darker, the trees closing in. I lost the trail a few times and had to backtrack, adding hours to my hike. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I threw my backpack into the trunk and got in, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine and pulled onto the road, I felt a wave of relief. I was safe. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods with me. Maybe it was just another camper, curious about my tent. Maybe it was someone looking to scare me, or maybe it was something worse. I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. What I do know is that I'll never camp alone again. I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up in Vermont, hiking and camping were natural parts of my life. So when I moved to Switzerland, I was thrilled to explore the Alps. This story happened last summer when I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in a remote valley. I thought it would be a peaceful getaway from the bustle of my daily routine. Couldn't have been more wrong. The weather forecast for the weekend was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures. I planned everything meticulously. Packed my tent, sleeping bag, stove, and enough food and water for 2 days. I even carried a small first aid kit and a satellite phone just in case. I chose a less traveled trail that led to a secluded spot near a small alpine lake. It was a place I'd read about online, described as tranquil and pristine, untouched by crowds. The hike to the campsite was breathtaking. Towering peaks surrounded me, their snow-capped summits glinting in the sunlight. The trail wound through dense forests, across bubbling streams, and over rocky ridges. Occasionally, I'd stop to take in the scenery or snap a photo. The air was crisp and clean, filling my lungs with every step. I felt alive. By late afternoon, I reached the lake. It was even more beautiful than I'd imagined. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the surrounding peaks like a mirror. Not a soul was in sight. It was exactly what I'd been looking for. I set up my tent on a flat patch of grass a few meters from the shore and gathered some dry wood for a small fire later. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, I cooked a simple meal and ate while watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. Felt like paradise. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I lit the fire and sat by it, enjoying the warmth and the crackling sound of burning wood. The stars came out, filling the sky with countless pinpoints of light. It was the kind of night that made you feel both insignificant and deeply connected to the universe. By 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire thoroughly, double-checked that everything was secure, and crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the gentle sound of water lapping against the shore. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The tent was pitch dark, and everything was silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. My heart was pounding, though I couldn't pinpoint what had startled me. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a dream or a distant animal noise. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I lay there for a while, listening intently. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel. It was distant but unmistakable. My first thought was that it might be a deer or some other wildlife, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy for an animal. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be another hiker? But why would someone be wandering around here in the middle of the night? This area wasn't exactly easy to reach. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to my campsite. My heart was now thudding so loudly I was afraid whoever it was might hear it. I stayed completely still, straining to hear. The steps stopped abruptly, maybe 20 meters from my tent. I held my breath, listening for any sign of movement. There was nothing but silence. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Then, without warning, I heard a new sound. It was subtle at first, a faint scratching noise, like something being dragged across fabric. My stomach dropped as I realized it was coming from my tent. Someone or something was touching it. I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body tense. The scratching moved along the side of the tent, slow and deliberate. I didn't dare move. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but I was paralyzed with fear. After what felt like an eternity, the scratching stopped. I waited, barely breathing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then I heard the footsteps again, retreating this time. They grew fainter until they disappeared entirely. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, too terrified to sleep. I kept my hand on the knife I'd brought, though I doubted it would do much good if I had to use it. When dawn finally came, I cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The first thing I noticed was that nothing seemed out of place. My gear was untouched, and there were no visible signs of disturbance around the campsite. But when I looked closer, I saw them. Footprints. They were unmistakably human, leading from the edge of the lake to my tent and then back into the forest. My blood ran cold. I quickly packed up my things, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The sense of unease was overwhelming. I'd planned to stay another night, but there was no way I was going to stick around. The hike back to my car felt endless. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I kept imagining someone watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the trunk and locked the doors as fast as I could. Only when I was several miles away did I start to feel a semblance of safety. Even now, months later, I can't explain what happened that night. Was it just a random passerby who meant no harm? Or was it something more sinister? I'll never know. One thing is certain, though. I haven't been camping alone since. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wilderness, far from the noise of the city, that feels so freeing. Last summer, I decided to take a solo camping trip to a national park I'd been wanting to explore for years. The park was known for its dense forests, stunning lakes, and challenging hiking trails. It sounded perfect for what I had in mind. A few days to clear my head, disconnect from my phone, and reconnect with nature. I spent a couple of weeks preparing. I bought a new tent, packed enough food to last 5 days, and made sure I had all the essentials. A first aid kit, a map, a compass, and a sturdy pair of hiking boots. I've always been cautious when it comes to outdoor trips. You never know what might happen, and I'd read enough stories about people getting lost or injured in the wilderness to know better than to take risks. The drive to the park took about 6 hours. As I got closer, the scenery changed from urban sprawl to rolling hills and then to thick forests. By the time I reached the park entrance, it was late afternoon. The ranger at the station handed me a map and pointed out a few good spots for camping. He warned me that some of the trails were pretty remote and that I should stick to the marked paths. I assured him I would and drove into the park. The campsite I chose was about 3 miles from the nearest trailhead. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, with a stream running nearby. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple dinner over the fire. As the sun set, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and frogs. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The first day went smoothly. I spent the morning hiking a loop trail that took me past a beautiful lake. The water was so clear I could see fish swimming near the shore. I stopped to eat lunch on a flat rock overlooking the lake, then hiked back to my campsite. By the time I returned, I was tired but content. I spent the evening reading a book by the fire before crawling into my tent and falling asleep to the sound of the stream. It was on the second night that things started to feel off. I'd spent the day exploring a more challenging trail that climbed up to a ridge with stunning views of the valley below. It was a tough hike, and I was exhausted by the time I got back to camp. I cooked dinner, sat by the fire for a while, and went to bed early. But I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside my tent, branches snapping, leaves rustling. At first, I told myself it was just animals. The forest was full of wildlife, and it wasn't unusual to hear them moving around at night. But the noises didn't stop. If anything, they seemed to get closer. I tried to ignore it, but my heart was racing. I strained my ears, trying to figure out what it was. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, not the random scurrying of an animal. Someone was walking around my campsite. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. The footsteps circled my tent, then stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, I heard the footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Everything seemed normal. There were no signs of anyone having been there. No footprints, no disturbed ground. I told myself I must have imagined it, that my tired mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up my gear and started hiking back to the trailhead. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway back, I stopped to rest. The trail was steep, and I needed a break. As I sat on a rock, drinking water, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt just off the trail. They weren't mine. They were larger than my boots and pointed in the same direction I was heading. Someone else had been on this trail recently. I felt a wave of unease but tried to brush it off. This was a popular park after all. It wasn't unusual for other hikers to be around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the footprints looked fresh. I stood up and continued walking, my pace a little faster now. As I neared the trailhead, I heard a noise behind me, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I stopped and turned around, but the trail was empty. The forest was silent. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, then forced myself to keep moving. I didn't stop again until I reached my car. I drove out of the park as fast as I could, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally started to relax. I told myself I'd overreacted, that the noises and footprints were nothing to worry about. But even now, months later, I can't forget the feeling of being watched, of not being alone out there. I don't know who or what was out there with me that night, and maybe I never will. But one thing is certain, I won't be going on another solo camping trip anytime soon. The first time I decided to go camping alone, I was determined to prove to myself that I could handle the wilderness without any help. I'd been camping many times before with friends and family, but this time was different. I wanted to test my skills, push my limits, and experience the solitude of nature. I chose a remote area in the Adirondacks, a place I'd read about in hiking forums. It was a rugged trail leading to an isolated lake surrounded by dense forest. The thought of being completely alone in such a place excited me. The drive to the trailhead took most of the morning. The sun was shining, and the air was crisp and cool. Perfect weather for hiking. I parked my car in a small gravel lot, shouldered my backpack, and double-checked my gear. I had everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a map, a compass, and a first aid kit. I even packed a bear canister for my food, just in case. The area was known for black bears, and I didn't want to take any chances. The trail started off easy, winding through tall pines and fir trees. The ground was covered in soft needles, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. I made good time, feeling confident and energized. As I went deeper into the forest, the trail became steeper and more rugged. Roots and rocks jutted out, making every step a careful calculation. The trees grew denser, and sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above. It was beautiful, but also a little unsettling. There was something about the silence of the deep woods that felt different when you're alone. After about 4 hours of hiking, I reached the lake. It was breathtaking. The water was so still it looked like glass, perfectly reflecting the surrounding trees and sky. I picked a spot on the shore to set up my camp, choosing a flat area with a good view of the lake. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected, but eventually, it was done. I arranged my gear inside and set up a small campfire using some dry wood I'd gathered along the way. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. Dinner was simple: dehydrated pasta and a granola bar. I ate by the fire, watching the colors of the sunset fade into twilight. The forest around me grew darker, and the sounds of the day, birds chirping, leaves rustling, were replaced by the nocturnal symphony of crickets and frogs. I felt a mix of awe and unease. This was what I had come for, I reminded myself, to experience the wild, raw and unfiltered. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I added a few more logs to the fire and sat close to it, feeling its warmth on my face. The stars came out, scattered across the sky like diamonds. I'd never seen so many stars before, living most of my life in areas with light pollution. For a while, I just sat there, taking it all in. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. But that peace didn't last. Around midnight, I heard the first sound that set me on edge. It was a low, distant rustling coming from the woods behind my tent. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. But the rustling grew louder, closer. I froze, straining my ears to pick up any other sounds. The fire crackled, and the wind whispered through the trees, but the rustling was unmistakable. It stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even more unnerving. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing. I'd read enough about the woods to know that sounds can be deceiving. But then I noticed something odd. The crickets and frogs had gone silent. The night felt heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I've always trusted my gut, and right then, it was screaming at me that something wasn't right. I decided to stay awake for a while longer, just to be safe. I added more wood to the fire, hoping the light would deter any curious animals. Sitting there, I kept my head on a swivel, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Every shadow seemed to shift, every faint sound amplified in the stillness. Time dragged on, and my nerves were stretched thin. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't rustling. It was a deliberate, heavy sound, like footsteps. Slow, measured, and deliberate. They came from the same direction as before, but closer now. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the woods. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and underbrush, but I saw nothing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a bear, but deep down I wasn't sure. I'd seen animal tracks on the trail earlier, but these footsteps didn't sound like a four-legged creature. They sounded human. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound. The footsteps stopped after a while, but the sense of being watched didn't. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first light, I decided to pack up and leave. I come out here for solitude, but this was too much. I wanted to be away from people, but the idea of someone or something lurking in the woods was more than I could handle. I quickly took down my tent, stuffed everything into my backpack, and started back down the trail. The hike back was grueling. My body was tired from lack of sleep, and my nerves were frayed. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. The forest, so beautiful the day before, now felt oppressive, its shadows hiding things I didn't want to see. About halfway back, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. On the side of the trail, there was a small clearing with a pile of rocks. At first, I thought it was just a natural formation, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. The rocks were arranged in a deliberate pattern, like a marker or a cairn. And on top of the pile was something that sent a chill down my spine. A single muddy boot. It was old and weathered, but it looked out of place. There was no reason for it to be there. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing. Was it left by another hiker? Or was it a warning? I didn't stick around to find out. I hurried past the clearing, my pace quickening with every step. The rest of the hike was a blur. I was running on pure adrenaline, desperate to reach the safety of my car. When I finally emerged from the woods and saw the gravel lot, I almost cried with relief. I threw my backpack into the car, got in, and locked the doors. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the silence of the forest, and the boot on the pile of rocks. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that I've never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. That trip was supposed to be about finding myself, but instead, I found something else. A reminder that the wilderness can be as unforgiving as it is beautiful. I haven't been camping alone since. I've always loved camping. Growing up in Vermont, the woods were my playground, and I'd spent countless weekends hiking trails and sleeping under the stars. It's where I felt most at peace, surrounded by nature's quiet, away from the hum of daily life. But after what happened last summer, I've struggled to look at the woods the same way. It started as a solo trip, something I'd done many times before. I'd recently moved to Switzerland, and I wanted to explore the mountains here the way I used to explore back home. I'd planned a 2-night stay deep in the forest, away from the popular trails. I'd mapped out my route meticulously, packed all the essentials, and even told a friend about my plans, just in case. Safety first, right? The first day went as expected. I parked my car at a small lot near the trailhead and hiked for hours. The scenery was stunning. Towering trees surrounded me, their leaves forming a dense canopy overhead. The trail was steep at times, but the challenge felt good. I passed a few other hikers early on, but as the day went on and I ventured farther from the main trail, the forest grew quieter. By late afternoon, I hadn't seen another soul for hours. I found a clearing near a small stream and decided it would be the perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was flat, the water was close, and there was enough open sky above to see the stars later. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and settled in. Dinner was simple, just a freeze-dried meal rehydrated with boiling water, but it tasted amazing after a long hike. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat by the fire, listening to the soothing sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. That first night was uneventful. I brought a book and read for a while by the light of my headlamp before crawling into my sleeping bag. The forest was alive with sounds, crickets chirping, the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle babble of the stream. It was comforting in a way. I drifted off easily, feeling completely at ease. The next morning, I woke early. The air was crisp and cool, and the forest was bathed in a soft golden light. After breakfast, I packed a small day bag with water and snacks and set off to explore the area. I'd marked a few interesting spots on my map, including a viewpoint that promised a stunning panoramic view of the valley below. The hike was challenging, but the view was worth it. I stood on the edge of a rocky outcrop, staring out at the vast expanse of green, dotted with patches of wildflowers. It was the kind of view that made you feel small in the best possible way. As I made my way back to camp, I noticed something odd. A few branches along the trail were broken, hanging at unnatural angles. It wasn't uncommon to see fallen branches in the woods, especially after a storm, but the weather had been calm. These breaks looked deliberate, as if someone had snapped them. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. The forest is full of oddities if you look hard enough. Back at camp, I spent the afternoon relaxing. I refilled my water bottles from the stream, using a filter to make sure it was safe to drink, and jotted down notes in my journal. Writing about my experiences in the moment helped me remember them later. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed a faint sound in the distance. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but it was hard to tell over the background noise of the stream. I paused, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. I brushed it off as an animal and went back to my journal. As the sun began to set, I prepared dinner and lit another small fire. The forest seemed quieter that evening, the usual chorus of crickets and birds more subdued. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a vague, unsettling sensation, like when you're sure someone's staring at you in a crowded room. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I'd been alone in the woods countless times before. This was no different. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I double-checked the perimeter of my camp, making sure my food was securely stored and that nothing seemed out of place. Everything looked fine, but the feeling lingered. That night, I lay awake in my tent, listening intently to the sounds outside. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made my heart race. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. I woke abruptly sometime in the early hours, my heart pounding. Took me a moment to figure out what had startled me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, close to my tent. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like someone or something moving through the underbrush. I lay still, my breath shallow, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, then stopped. I gripped the handle of my camping knife, the only weapon I had, and waited. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and the forest grew silent again. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of my tent cautiously. The clearing looked just as I'd left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up camp quickly, eager to get back to the safety of my car. The hike back to the trailhead felt longer than it had on the way in. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed suspicious. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. About halfway back, I came across something that made my stomach drop. A small cairn of rocks stood in the middle of the trail. It hadn't been there before. The rocks were stacked neatly, deliberately, and there were no other trails nearby that someone could have come from. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe another hiker had passed through, but why build a cairn here in the middle of nowhere? I didn't stop to investigate. The uneasy feeling had turned into full-blown fear. I pushed forward, hiking as fast as I could without running. The forest seemed darker, the trees pressing in on either side. I'd never felt so exposed. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I threw my pack into the trunk and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The relief I felt when I hit the main road was overwhelming. I've replayed those 2 days in my mind countless times since then, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe it was just my imagination, heightened by being alone in an unfamiliar place. But the broken branches, the footsteps, the cairn, it all felt too deliberate to ignore. I haven't been camping since. The woods, once my sanctuary, now feel like a place of danger. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to convince myself there was nothing to fear. But deep down, I know something was out there, watching me, and I'm not eager to find out what. Camping alone in the woods was supposed to be an escape. I needed time to myself, away from the city, the noise, the constant pull of responsibilities. I found a spot through an online forum, one that was described as remote but beautiful, tucked in the shadow of a mountain range and next to a quiet lake. The reviews were glowing, serene, untouched, peaceful, perfect. I packed everything I thought I'd need. A sturdy tent, plenty of food, water filtration equipment, a first aid kit, and my trusty old camping knife. I even bought a satellite phone for emergencies. I'd done solo trips before, but this was further out than I'd ever been. The idea thrilled me. The drive took most of the day, winding through small towns and finally onto a dirt road that seemed to stretch endlessly. The GPS signal vanished about an hour in, but I had written down directions beforehand. As the trees grew denser and the road narrower, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. I wasn't sure if I'd see another human for days. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows. The clearing was as perfect as described. The lake shimmered in the fading light, surrounded by towering pines. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, a crispness that felt cleansing. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, far enough to avoid condensation but close enough to enjoy the view. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some instant noodles over my portable stove, watched the stars, and listened to the occasional rustle of wildlife. The solitude was comforting. I fell asleep quickly, the sound of the lake's gentle lapping lulling me into a deep sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore. I followed a faint trail that led around the lake, carrying a small day pack with water, snacks, and a map. The trail wasn't well marked, but it was easy enough to follow. The forest was alive with the chatter of birds and the occasional rustle of squirrels. Every so often, I'd pause to take in the scenery, the sunlight filtering through the canopy, the way the lake sparkled through the gaps in the trees. I walked for hours, losing track of time. When I finally checked my watch, it was well past noon. I decided to head back, retracing my steps along the trail. That's when I noticed it, a distinct feeling of being watched. It wasn't overt, just a prickling at the back of my neck, an unease that grew as the forest grew quieter. The birds had stopped chirping, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I told myself I was imagining things. It's easy for the mind to play tricks when you're alone in the wilderness. Still, I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. I reached my campsite without incident, but the feeling lingered. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it. A crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. My heart raced. I strained my ears, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the sound wasn't erratic like a deer or a raccoon. It was deliberate, measured, human. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees, the beam slicing through the darkness. "Hello," I called, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. No response. The footsteps stopped. I held the light steady, scanning the forest edge. Nothing. For the next hour, I sat by the fire, gripping my knife and staring into the darkness. The sounds didn't return, but sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, I found footprints near the edge of my campsite. They were unmistakably human, and they hadn't been there the day before. My stomach churned. I wasn't entirely alone out here. Someone else was nearby, and they knew where I was. I spent the day trying to shake the unease. I stayed close to the campsite, keeping my knife within arm's reach. I rationalized that it could be another camper, maybe someone passing through who didn't want to disturb me. But why wouldn't they make themselves known? Why approach my site at night? That evening, I built the fire bigger than usual, its warmth and light a small comfort. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to close in around me. Every rustle, every crackle of the firewood set my nerves on edge. I forced myself to eat, though my appetite had vanished. The footsteps returned, closer this time. I froze, listening as they circled the campsite just beyond the firelight. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't step into view. They just moved, slowly and deliberately. My hands trembled as I gripped the knife. The fire's light flickered, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. "I have a weapon," I shouted, my voice breaking slightly. "If you come any closer, I'll use it." The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before I heard the crunch of retreating steps. They faded into the distance, leaving me alone with the crackling fire and my racing heart. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I started packing. My hands shook as I stuffed gear into my backpack, constantly glancing around. The campsite that had felt like a sanctuary now felt like a trap. The hike back to my car was grueling. Every snap of a twig, every shadow, felt like a threat. I forced myself to move quickly but carefully, unwilling to risk a twisted ankle or worse. The forest that had seemed so welcoming now felt oppressive, every tree a potential hiding spot. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back and locked the doors the moment I got inside. My hands were still trembling as I started the engine. The drive back down the dirt road felt endless, but with every mile that passed, the tension in my chest eased slightly. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was just another camper, curious but cautious. Maybe it was someone with darker intentions. I'll never know, and honestly, I don't want to. What I do know is that the woods, for all their beauty, hold an unpredictability that I'll never underestimate again. I haven't been camping since. I've always been a fan of camping. There's something about being out in the middle of nowhere that makes me feel alive. The crisp air, the scent of pine, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, it all feels like an escape from the chaos of daily life. That's why, when I had a free weekend, I decided to head out into the mountains alone. I had a spot in mind, a secluded place I'd read about online, far enough from the beaten path to ensure privacy, but not so remote as to be dangerous. Or so I thought. I packed light but made sure to bring all the essentials. A sturdy tent, a warm sleeping bag, plenty of food and water, and a small camping stove. I even had a first aid kit, a headlamp, and a good quality knife just in case. My plan was simple. Hike in about 5 miles, set up camp near a small lake I'd seen on the map, and spend the weekend fishing, reading, and enjoying the solitude. The drive to the trailhead took a couple of hours. As I pulled into the gravel parking lot, I noticed only one other car parked there. A dusty sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in days. I didn't think much of it at the time. People often leave their cars at trailheads while they embark on multi-day hikes. Still, I made a mental note of it before hoisting my pack onto my shoulders and setting off down the trail. The hike started off beautifully. The trail wound through a dense forest, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patches. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional call of a bird. It was exactly what I'd been hoping for. After about 3 miles, the trail became steeper, and I had to stop a few times to catch my breath. But the effort was worth it. When I reached the top of the ridge, the view was stunning. Below me was the lake, its surface shimmering in the sunlight. The water was so clear I could see the rocky bottom even from up high. Surrounding it were tall pines and rugged cliffs. It looked like a postcard. I made my way down to the lake and found a flat spot to set up my tent. It was near the water but far enough back to avoid any dampness. After pitching the tent, I gathered some firewood and set up a small fire ring with rocks. By the time I was done, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I cooked a quick meal on my camping stove, nothing fancy, just some instant noodles and a cup of tea, and settled in by the fire to enjoy the evening. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, frogs croaked, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, but there was also an undercurrent of unease. Maybe it was just the fact that I was alone, but every rustle in the bushes made me turn my head. I reminded myself that it was probably just small animals, a raccoon or a deer, and tried to relax. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The night was cold, but I felt safe inside my little nylon cocoon. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me. I lay there in the dark, listening. The forest was quiet now, eerily so. Even the crickets had gone silent. That's when I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started to race. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote, but the sound was too deliberate. It wasn't the random scuffling of a foraging creature. It was the measured pace of something moving on 2 legs. I reached for my headlamp and knife, my hands trembling. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of my headlamp cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the ground around my campsite. I didn't see anything unusual, but the footsteps had stopped. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming and the sound had carried over into my waking mind. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, though it took a long time for my heartbeat to slow enough for me to fall asleep again. The next morning, the unease lingered. As I stepped out of my tent, I noticed something strange. The firewood I'd stacked neatly the night before was scattered across the ground. At first, I thought an animal might have gotten into it, but there were no claw marks or bite marks on the wood. It looked more like someone had kicked it around. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, but I hadn't seen any sign of another person. The thought of packing up and leaving crossed my mind, but I dismissed it. I'd come all this way to enjoy a weekend in nature, and I wasn't going to let a few strange noises ruin it. After breakfast, I spent the day exploring the area around the lake. I found a small stream that fed into it and spent a couple of hours fishing. The trout were biting, and I managed to catch a few decent-sized ones. By the time I got back to camp, I felt more relaxed. The sun was shining, the lake was calm, and the strange events of the night before felt like a distant memory. That evening, I cooked the trout over the fire and enjoyed one of the best meals I'd had in a long time. As the sun set, I sat by the fire and read a book, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the trees. I started to feel like I'd overreacted. The forest could be unsettling at night, especially when you're alone, but that was part of its charm. I went to bed early, tired from the day's activities. This time, I fell asleep almost immediately, but once again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, it wasn't a sound that woke me, but a feeling. I can't explain it, but it was like my body knew something was wrong before my mind did. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear anything unusual. First, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it, the sound of breathing. It was coming from right outside my tent. Every muscle in my body tensed. I didn't dare move. The breathing was slow and heavy, like someone trying to remain quiet but not quite succeeding. I gripped my knife tightly, my palms slick with sweat. The seconds stretched into minutes, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, waiting to see if it would return. When it didn't, I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and look outside. The fire had died down to embers, and the campsite was bathed in pale moonlight. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I shone my headlamp around, illuminating the trees and the ground, but I didn't see anything. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I started packing up my gear. I'd had enough of this place. As I was taking down my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. About 20 feet from where I'd been sleeping, there were footprints in the soft dirt. They were large, unmistakably human, and they led from the edge of the trees right up to my tent before circling around and disappearing back into the forest. I left in a hurry, my heart racing the entire hike back to the car. When I reached the trailhead, I was relieved to see my car exactly where I'd left it. The other car was still there, too, though it now looked even more weathered and abandoned. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow on the road, every car behind me, made me jumpy. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about that trip. I've replayed the events over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of them. I don't know who or what was out there with me, but one thing is certain: I'll never camp alone again. It started as a solo camping trip. I had always liked the idea of being out in the wilderness alone, away from the chaos of daily life. There was something calming about the thought of being surrounded by nothing but trees, rivers, and the distant sound of wildlife. So, when I finally got a break from work, I packed my gear, loaded up the car, and headed out to a remote camping spot that I had read about online. The area was supposed to be serene, with minimal foot traffic and breathtaking views. The drive itself took almost 5 hours, winding through rural roads and gradually narrowing into unpaved paths. My GPS eventually gave out, and I had to rely on a printed map, something I hadn't done in years. The final stretch to the campsite was a single dirt track that cut through a dense forest. Tall trees loomed on either side, their branches forming a canopy that let in only specks of sunlight. Felt like I was entering another world. When I arrived, the place was just as beautiful as I had imagined. There was a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, and just a short walk away, a pristine lake sparkled under the afternoon sun. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, where I could see the lake through the trees. There wasn't another soul in sight, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. It was perfect. After setting up camp, I spent some time exploring the area. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest, marveling at how untouched everything felt. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and pine. I spotted deer tracks in the mud and even caught a glimpse of a fox darting between the trees. Felt good to be out there, away from everything. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was beginning to set. I gathered some firewood, built a small fire, and cooked a simple dinner of beans and rice. As I ate, I watched the sky change colors, from orange to pink to deep purple. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the entire sky was dotted with them. It was a sight you could never see in the city. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the stillness. The forest seemed to come alive at night, with the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The fire cast flickering shadows on the trees, and for a moment, I felt a pang of unease. It's funny how your mind can play tricks on you when you're alone in the dark. But I shook it off, reminding myself that I was miles away from anyone and anything that could pose a threat. Eventually, I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped up the door. My sleeping bag was warm and comfortable, and the rhythmic sounds of the forest soon lulled me to sleep. I don't know what woke me up. It was still dark outside, and for a moment, I lay there, disoriented. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But as I lay there, listening, the sound grew louder. It wasn't just the occasional crackle of leaves. It was deliberate, steady, like footsteps. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps grew closer, crunching on the dry leaves outside my tent. My heart was pounding now, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I told myself it could still be an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Animals don't walk like that. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then I heard a faint scraping sound, like something brushing against the fabric of the tent. I froze, too terrified to move. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be another camper? But why would anyone be out here in the middle of the night, in such a remote area? I reached for the flashlight I had left by my side, my hands trembling. Slowly, I clicked it on and shone the beam toward the tent wall where I had heard the sound. The fabric glowed faintly under the light, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no outline of a figure, just the empty forest beyond. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, clutching the flashlight and staring at the tent wall. Eventually, the sounds stopped, and the forest returned to its usual symphony of night noises. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe brushing against the tent out of curiosity. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though I hardly slept. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept the flashlight in my hand the entire time. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. The sunlight made everything seem less frightening. I stepped out of the tent, blinking in the bright light. The clearing looked exactly as it had the day before, as if nothing had happened. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Around the perimeter of my campsite, the grass and dirt were disturbed, as if someone or something had been walking in circles. The tracks were too large to belong to an animal, and they were fresh. I quickly packed up my gear, my mind racing. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew I didn't want to stick around to find out. As I loaded my backpack and started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would stop and glance over my shoulder, but the forest seemed empty. The hike back to my car felt endless. The trail that had seemed so inviting the day before now felt oppressive. The trees closing in around me. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race, and I found myself walking faster and faster, driven by a growing sense of urgency. I just wanted to get out of there. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But that relief was short-lived. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But when I looked again, it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I haven't gone camping since. I never considered myself the outdoorsy type, but a camping trip seemed like a good way to reset my mind. Life had been a constant grind, work, bills, repeat. So, when a coworker mentioned a remote spot in the mountains, I decided it was time for a break. The idea of being alone in the wilderness was both thrilling and a little nerve-wracking. Still, I needed to disconnect from the noise of daily life. I spent the week gathering supplies. My backpack felt like it weighed a ton: a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water bottles, a first aid kit, and a small camping stove. I made sure to pack a map and compass, even though my phone's GPS was supposed to work in that area. Better safe than sorry. The drive to the trailhead took almost 5 hours. The last stretch of road was barely more than a dirt path winding through dense forest. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and cool, a welcome change from the stale city air I'd been breathing for months. When I reached the parking area, there were no other cars. That was part of the appeal, complete solitude. The trail was well marked, winding through towering pines and thick underbrush. My pack dug into my shoulders as I hiked, but the scenery made up for the discomfort. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting shifting patterns on the ground. Birds chirped overhead, and every now and then, a squirrel darted across the path. It felt like I'd stepped into another world, one far removed from the chaos of my usual routine. After about 3 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing beside a stream. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was flat, and the sound of running water was soothing. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, making sure it was far enough from the stream to avoid any flooding if it rained. By the time everything was set up, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I gathered some firewood and got a small campfire going. Dinner was simple, a can of soup heated over the fire. As I ate, the forest around me came alive with nighttime sounds. Crickets chirped, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals moving about. It was peaceful, yet there was an underlying unease I couldn't shake. Being so far from civilization meant I was vulnerable. If something went wrong, help was hours away. I crawled into my tent around 9 p.m., exhausted from the hike. The sleeping bag was warm and surprisingly comfortable. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the sound of the stream and the crackling remnants of the fire. I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The forest was eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the faint gurgle of the stream. My heart pounded as I lay there, listening. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. I froze. The sound was too deliberate to be an animal. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be moving slowly, cautiously. My mind raced. Was it another camper, a hunter, or someone with less innocent intentions? I didn't dare move, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing my tent. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the fabric of my tent rustled. My stomach dropped. Someone was outside. I reached for the knife I'd packed, my hands trembling. "Hello!" I finally managed to call out, my voice shaky. There was no response. The rustling stopped, and I thought maybe they'd left. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of a zipper. Not mine, but the extra compartment on my backpack that I'd left outside the tent. Whoever it was, they were going through my stuff. My fear turned to anger. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked out. The moon provided enough light to see a figure crouched over my pack. They were wearing dark clothes and had their back to me. "Hey, get away from my stuff!" I shouted, adrenaline overriding my fear. The person bolted into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I grabbed a flashlight and scanned the area. My pack was still there, but the zipper was open and some items were scattered on the ground. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the encounter left me shaken. I couldn't go back to sleep, so I stayed by the fire, knife in hand, until dawn. The next day, I debated whether to pack up and leave, but part of me didn't want to be scared off. I told myself it was probably just a random person who didn't mean any harm. Maybe they were lost and looking for supplies. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the day exploring the area, trying to distract myself. The forest was beautiful, with moss-covered rocks and towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. I found a small waterfall upstream and spent some time there, letting the sound of rushing water calm my nerves. By the time I returned to camp, I felt a bit more at ease. That night, I made sure everything was secured inside the tent. I even moved the fire closer to the entrance for extra light. Despite my precautions, I had trouble falling asleep. Every little noise made me jump. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I woke up again, this time to a snapping sound. It was loud, like a branch breaking underfoot. My heart raced as I listened. The footsteps were back, heavier this time. They circled the tent slowly, deliberately. Whoever it was didn't care about being quiet anymore. I grabbed the knife and flashlight, my hands shaking. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. My mind raced with possibilities. What did they want? Were they armed? I didn't want to confront them, but I also didn't want to wait for them to make the first move. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The beam of light caught a pair of boots before the figure darted out of sight. They were still there, lurking in the darkness. "I have a knife. Leave me alone," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. There was no response. The forest fell silent again. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife tightly. By morning, I'd made up my mind. It wasn't safe to stay here. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. The hike back to the trailhead felt endless. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move between the trees, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors as fast as I could. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. I never figured out who that person was or what they wanted. Maybe they were just trying to scare me, or maybe their intentions were worse. All I know is that I've never felt more vulnerable or alone. The experience left me shaken, but also grateful to be alive. I haven't gone camping since, and I'm not sure I ever will. I've always loved camping. It's been a tradition in my family since I was a kid. There's something about leaving the buzz of daily life behind and finding solace in the simplicity of nature. So, when I planned a solo trip to a remote camping spot deep in the national forest, I wasn't nervous. I was excited. The plan was simple. 3 days in the wilderness, alone with my thoughts and the beauty of the world around me. I'd picked this spot after scouring maps and online forums. It wasn't marked on most official guides, but a few seasoned hikers swore by its beauty and isolation. It was a bit of a trek to get there, but I'd done longer hikes before. I started out early on a crisp Friday morning. My backpack was heavy with essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, plenty of food, and a first aid kit. The trailhead was empty when I arrived, as I'd hoped. The hike to the campsite was about 6 miles, mostly uphill with some rough terrain. It wasn't an easy hike, but I liked the challenge. The air was cool and smelled like pine, and the forest was alive with birdsong and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The first few hours passed quickly. The trail was narrow but well-defined, winding through dense woods and occasional clearings. I crossed a shallow stream and paused to refill my water bottle with my filtration pump. The water was ice-cold and refreshing, a reminder of how far removed I was from the comforts of home. As I climbed higher, the forest grew thicker. The trees towered above me, their branches knitting together to form a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patches on the forest floor. I kept an eye out for landmarks mentioned in the forum posts: a peculiar rock formation, a cluster of birch trees, and finally, the small clearing where I'd set up camp. I reached the clearing around mid-afternoon. It was perfect, a flat patch of ground surrounded by tall pines, with a view of a small valley below. A fallen tree made a convenient bench, and there was a fire ring left by previous campers. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and gathered some firewood from the surrounding area. Everything felt peaceful. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal over the fire and watched the stars come out. The sky was clear, and without the light pollution of the city, the stars seemed endless. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures: crickets, owls, and the occasional rustle of something larger moving through the underbrush. I felt completely at ease. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I left my camp set up and packed a smaller day pack with water, snacks, and a map. The forest was beautiful, with towering trees, moss-covered rocks, and small streams winding their way through the landscape. I found a small waterfall about a mile from my camp and spent some time there, enjoying the solitude. It was on my way back to camp that I noticed something odd. A faint trail branched off the main path, one that hadn't been marked on my map. It looked old and overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in years. Curious, I followed it for a short distance. The trail led to a small clearing with a rusted metal box half buried in the dirt. It looked like an old ammo can, the kind you might find at a military surplus store. I hesitated before opening it. Part of me thought it might be someone's geocache, but when I lifted the lid, I found a few odd items: a weathered notebook, a rusted pocket knife, and a small tin of what looked like charcoal. The notebook was damp and hard to read, but I could make out fragments of handwriting. Most of it was mundane. Lists of supplies, a few rough sketches of the area, but one line stood out: "Do not stay more than one night." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was probably just someone's idea of a joke, but it unnerved me. I put the items back in the box, returned it to its spot, and headed back to my camp, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. That night, I couldn't relax. The forest seemed quieter than before, as if it was holding its breath. I told myself it was just my imagination, a result of finding that strange note. I double-checked my camp, making sure everything was secure before crawling into my tent. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was dark and silent. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps crunching on leaves. It was distant at first, but it grew closer. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, barely daring to move. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before unzipping my tent just enough to peek outside. The forest was still and empty. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down I wasn't convinced. The next morning, I found footprints around my campsite. They weren't mine. They were larger and spaced farther apart, as if whoever had made them was running. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started back down the trail. The hike back was tense. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The forest, which had felt so inviting just a day ago, now felt oppressive and threatening. When I finally reached my car, I was exhausted but relieved. I threw my gear into the back seat and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was back home, safe and surrounded by the familiarity of my apartment, that I allowed myself to relax. I never found out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just another camper, someone who didn't realize how much they'd scared me. Or maybe it was something else, something I'm better off not knowing. Either way, it was a lesson I'll never forget. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes it's better to trust your instincts and leave while you can. I decided to spend a long weekend camping in the wilderness. It was late October, and the air had just the right chill to remind me that winter wasn't far off. The plan was simple: 3 nights out in the woods, no distractions, just me, my tent, and the serenity of nature. I wanted to unplug from everything: work, emails, people. I packed light but thorough: a sturdy tent, my sleeping bag, a small propane stove, enough food for a few days, a water purifier, and all the essentials. I chose a spot about 2 hours from my town, deep in a forest known for its isolation. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive out there was uneventful, a mix of paved roads that turned to gravel, then dirt, leading to the trailhead. I parked my car in a small, nearly empty lot. There were only 2 other vehicles there, but the trails were vast enough that I doubted I'd run into anyone. After locking up my car and shouldering my pack, I began the hike. The forest welcomed me with towering pines and rustling leaves. The trail was well marked but narrow, winding through the dense trees and leading deeper into solitude. I reached my planned campsite about 5 miles in. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving stream with a fire ring left by past campers. It seemed perfect. The sound of the water was soothing, and the clearing gave me just enough sky to stargaze at night. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and took in the surroundings. The nearest trail was at least half a mile away, and there was no sign of other campers. It felt like I had the entire forest to myself. The first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal on my stove and watched the fire crackle as the temperature dropped. The silence out there was profound. No hum of electricity, no distant traffic, just the occasional rustle of the wind and the calls of nocturnal animals. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the rhythmic gurgle of the stream. The second day started slow. I woke up with the sunrise, brewed some coffee, and planned a day hike. There was a trail that looped around a nearby ridge, offering views of the valley below. I left most of my gear at the campsite, taking only a small day pack with water, snacks, and a map. The hike was breathtaking. The forest opened up at the ridge, revealing a panorama of rolling hills covered in fiery autumn colors. It was exactly the kind of escape I'd hoped for. I returned to camp in the late afternoon, tired but content. I was looking forward to another quiet evening by the fire. But as I approached the clearing, I noticed something odd. My campsite looked off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. My tent was still there, and nothing appeared out of place from a distance. But as I got closer, I realized my gear had been disturbed. The zipper on my tent was partially open, and my backpack, which I'd left inside, was now sitting outside the tent, unzipped. Its contents had been rummaged through. My first thought was animals. Maybe a raccoon or a curious bear had come through while I was gone. But nothing was torn or chewed on, which didn't fit with how animals usually behaved. Plus, my food bag, hung high in a tree, was untouched. That's when I noticed footprints in the soft dirt near the tent. Human footprints. My stomach dropped. I scanned the area, heart pounding. There was no one in sight, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I told myself it was probably another hiker who stumbled across my camp, maybe thinking it was abandoned. But why would they go through my stuff? I checked my belongings carefully. Nothing seemed to be missing, but everything felt violated. My tent, my space, my sense of safety. I decided to stay put. Packing up and hiking out would mean trekking through the forest at dusk, which didn't feel any safer. That night, I built the fire larger than before, its glow casting long shadows into the trees. I ate quickly, constantly glancing into the darkness. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I convinced myself it was just animals, but the unease wouldn't go away. When it was time to sleep, I moved my backpack into the tent and kept my knife close at hand. I'd always thought of camping as a peaceful escape, but now I felt trapped, surrounded by an infinite expanse of shadows. Sleep came in fits. Every time I started to drift off, a noise or the weight of my own paranoia would jerk me awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside the tent, slow, deliberate crunches in the leaves. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear more. The sound stopped, and the forest returned to its usual chorus of insects and the stream. I told myself it was my imagination, but I didn't sleep much after that. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light seeped through the fabric of my tent, I was already packed. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the car. As I stepped out of the tent, I stopped cold. The fire pit had been tampered with. The ashes from the previous night were scattered, and a stick had been driven into the ground next to it, with a small bundle of sticks and leaves tied to the top. It looked deliberate, almost like a warning or a marker. My blood ran cold. I didn't waste any time breaking camp. I stuffed everything into my pack haphazardly and set off down the trail, constantly looking over my shoulder. The 5 miles back to the parking lot felt like 20. Every sound, every movement in the trees made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me, staying just out of sight. When I finally reached the lot, I was relieved to see my car untouched. I threw my gear into the trunk and got in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine and pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. but there was nothing, just the empty lot and the dense forest beyond. The drive home felt surreal, like I was leaving a bad dream behind, but the unease lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints, the disturbed campsite, the strange marker by the fire pit. Someone had been out there with me, watching, waiting. I haven't been camping since. It was just supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. I had been feeling a bit overwhelmed lately with work, social obligations, and just the daily grind. So, when a couple of friends suggested a camping trip in the woods, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to disconnect, enjoy some peace and quiet, and recharge. We decided on a spot in a national forest about 2 hours outside the city. The place was secluded enough that we wouldn't run into anyone else, but not so remote that it felt unsafe. It was an area I had driven past before but never ventured into. A bit of adventure was exactly what I needed. The drive there was quiet, with nothing but the hum of the tires on the road and the occasional rustling of trees as we got deeper into the forest. The air felt fresher the further we went, the scent of pine and damp earth filling the car. We stopped at a small ranger station on the outskirts of the forest to grab a map and double-check that camping was allowed in the area we had picked out. The ranger behind the desk was friendly enough, though he had an odd look in his eyes when we asked about the specific campsite. "You sure about that one?" he asked, his voice a little too casual, a little too concerned. "It's a bit off the beaten path. A lot of people like it for its privacy, but, well, you just want to be careful." His words weren't overtly warning us to stay away, but something in the way he said it made me uneasy. We thanked him, grabbed the map, and headed out. The drive to the campsite took us deeper into the woods. The roads were rough, and the further we got, the more isolated everything seemed. There were no signs of other campers, no people, just trees and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. My friends joked about the eerie silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though I couldn't pinpoint why. When we finally arrived at the campsite, it was perfect. A small clearing, tucked away between a ring of tall, thick pines. The spot was quiet, isolated, and perfect for a weekend away from the world. We set up the tent, unpacked our gear, and made a fire. The evening sky was clear, and the stars shone brighter than I had ever seen before. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect. We spent the night chatting around the fire, roasting marshmallows, and enjoying the calm. But as the night wore on, a strange tension settled over the group. There was something off about the place, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway, and the crackling of the fire felt strangely loud against the stillness of the night. I went to gather more wood for the fire, and as I stepped away from the group, I felt that nagging feeling again. It was as if the woods were alive, watching, waiting for something. I returned to the fire, trying to shake off the unease, but I couldn't. The rest of the night passed in a blur, and we eventually crawled into our tents to sleep. That's when things started to get strange. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon rummaging around. But the sound kept coming, a soft shuffling, followed by the occasional snap of a twig. I lay there in the dark, listening. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. But there was no wind, no reason for the noise. I held my breath, straining my ears. The sound was getting closer, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I reached over to my bag, grabbed my flashlight, and slowly unzipped the tent. My heart pounded in my chest. The beam of light flicked across the dark woods outside, but there was nothing there. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a raccoon or some other animal. But that nagging feeling returned, the same one I'd had earlier when we first arrived. I zipped the tent back up, crawled into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep, but every little noise made my heart race. Morning came, and we all gathered around the campfire, trying to shake off the weirdness of the night. Everyone seemed to have had trouble sleeping, but none of us wanted to admit it. We laughed it off, made breakfast, and started planning a hike to explore the area around the campsite. The hike started off easy enough. The sun was out, the air was crisp, and the forest was beautiful. But as we walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, had all but stopped. It was as if the forest itself had gone silent. I pointed it out to my friends, but they didn't seem to notice. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. As we walked, the trail grew narrower, and the trees seemed to close in around us. We came across an old cabin, tucked away in a clearing. The place looked abandoned, the windows boarded up, the roof sagging with age. Something about the cabin felt wrong. I tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine as I pushed the door open. Inside, it was dark and musty. The air felt thick, stale, like the cabin had been untouched for years. Dust covered everything, and the floor creaked beneath our feet as we explored. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the far wall of the cabin, scratched into the wood, were strange marks. The lines were uneven, jagged, as if someone had carved them into the wall in a frenzy. I stepped closer to get a better look. The marks were too distinct to be the work of an animal. They looked almost like words. I could make out a few of the symbols, but they didn't make sense. I backed away from the wall, a sense of dread flooding through me. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I turned to my friends, ready to leave, but they were all staring at the floor, their faces pale. One of them pointed to the corner of the room. There, lying on the ground, was an old, tattered backpack. It looked like it had been there for years, but what caught our attention were the items strewn across the floor near it. An old, cracked flashlight, a torn map, and a weathered journal. I picked up the journal, my hands shaking. As I flipped through the pages, I felt my stomach drop. The entries were frantic, disjointed. The writer had been documenting their time in the woods, but the last few pages were filled with panic. "They're watching me," one entry read. "I can hear them outside. The footsteps never stop." The final entry was nothing but a wild scrawl, a desperate plea for help. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong here. Whatever had happened to the person who wrote this journal was something I didn't want to know. I shoved the journal back into the bag, and we all agreed it was time to leave. But as we made our way back to camp, the feeling of being watched never left. The silence in the forest was oppressive, and every shadow seemed to shift just out of the corner of my eye. By the time we returned to the campsite, I was on edge, every little sound making me jump. I wanted to leave, but we were miles from civilization, and the sun was starting to set. We spent the evening sitting around the fire again, the crackling flames doing little to ease my nerves. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but even that didn't feel normal. The air felt charged, as though something was about to happen. It was then that I heard the footsteps again. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then the sound came closer. Soft, slow, deliberate. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My friends were too busy talking, oblivious to the noise. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the edge of the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were getting louder, closer. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, shining the light into the trees. Nothing, just the wind. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was right behind me. I spun around, the beam of light flashing across the clearing. There, just at the edge of the firelight, was a figure standing in the shadows. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The seconds stretched into what felt like eternity before it finally turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't wait another second. I ran back to the campsite, shouting for everyone to pack up. We were leaving no matter what. The fear in my chest was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had overstayed our welcome in these woods. By the time we packed up and made it back to the car, the sun had set completely, leaving us in the darkness of the night. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror as we drove, half expecting to see someone or something following us. But there was nothing. We made it back to the city without incident, and I didn't look back. Whatever had happened in those woods, whatever was watching us, stayed behind. But it's a feeling I'll never forget, and I know one thing for sure. I'll never camp in that forest again. Some places are meant to be left undisturbed, and some things should remain in the shadows. I've always been drawn to the mountains, the solitude, the quiet. It's a world away from the constant buzz of everyday life. When I planned a solo camping trip to a remote part of the Rockies, I thought it would be just another peaceful escape. I packed my gear meticulously. A sturdy tent, a reliable sleeping bag, plenty of food, and all the essentials for backcountry camping. I'd done trips like this before, so I didn't think twice about heading out alone. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the winding roads leading me deeper into the wilderness. By the time I parked my car and hoisted my backpack, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the dense forest. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, weaving through towering pines and past sparkling streams. It was a perfect day for hiking, crisp air, blue skies, and not a soul in sight. My plan was to hike about 10 miles into the backcountry and set up camp near a small alpine lake I'd read about. The trail wasn't marked on most maps, but I had a detailed GPS and a printed topographical map, just in case. As I walked, the sounds of civilization faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. After several hours, I reached the lake. It was even more beautiful than I'd imagined. Crystal clear water reflecting the surrounding peaks, the surface undisturbed except for the occasional ripple from a passing breeze. I chose a flat spot near the shore and set up my tent, taking my time to secure it properly. The ground was firm but not rocky, and the location offered a stunning view of the lake and the mountains beyond. Once my camp was set up, I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area. There were no signs of other campers, which didn't surprise me given how remote the location was. I found a small stream feeding into the lake and refilled my water bottles, filtering the water to be safe. I even spotted a deer grazing in a meadow nearby, its ears twitching as it kept an eye on me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature began to drop. I built a small fire using what I'd gathered earlier, keeping it contained within the fire ring I'd made with stones. Dinner was a simple affair, freeze-dried lasagna and a cup of hot tea. Sitting by the fire, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was a glittering tapestry. It was moments like this that made me love camping. I went to bed early, tired from the hike and lulled by the sound of the wind in the trees. My sleeping bag was warm and comfortable, and I fell asleep almost immediately. The night was uneventful, at least as far as I knew. When I woke up the next morning, everything seemed normal. The air was brisk, the lake calm, and my camp untouched. I had breakfast, packed a day pack with some snacks and water, and decided to explore the surrounding area further. The terrain was rugged but manageable. I followed a faint animal trail that led me up a ridge overlooking the lake. The view was breathtaking, the kind of scene you see on postcards but rarely experience in real life. I spent a few hours wandering, taking in the sights and occasionally marking my path with small cairns to ensure I could find my way back. It was around midday when I first noticed something odd. As I made my way back toward camp, I came across a tree with deep scratches on its trunk. They were vertical and spaced out, too large to be from any small animal. I paused, trying to remember if I'd seen the marks on my way up. I couldn't be sure, but it didn't seem like something I'd overlook. My first thought was a bear, but the scratches were higher than I'd expect even from a large one. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I took a photo with my phone and continued on. When I returned to camp, everything seemed fine. My tent was intact, and nothing appeared disturbed. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Maybe the scratches were old, or maybe I just missed them earlier. Either way, I resolved to be more vigilant. I spent the rest of the afternoon fishing in the lake, catching a couple of small trout that I cooked for dinner. The fresh fish was a welcome change from the packaged meals, and it helped to lift my spirits. That night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. I told myself it was just my imagination and forced myself to sleep. But my sleep was restless, filled with vague, unsettling dreams that left me on edge when I woke up. The next day, I decided to cut my trip short. The scratches, the silence. It all felt like a sign that I shouldn't stay any longer. I packed up my camp efficiently, double-checking to make sure I left nothing behind. As I hoisted my pack and started back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but the forest remained still, the only sounds my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. About halfway back to the trailhead, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A series of tracks crossed the trail heading into the woods. They were large and unmistakably fresh. I crouched down to examine them, my heart pounding. They looked like bear tracks, but larger than any I'd seen before. The spacing between the steps suggested whatever made them was moving quickly. I stood up, my mind racing. The scratches on the tree, the silence, the tracks. It was all adding up to something I didn't want to think about. I quickened my pace, my senses on high alert. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. The trail felt longer than it had on the way in, each step taking more effort as my anxiety grew. As I neared the trailhead, I heard a sound that stopped me in my tracks. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere off to my right. I froze, my eyes darting toward the trees. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a sudden rustling as something moved through the underbrush. I didn't wait to see what it was. I broke into a run, my pack bouncing against my back as I sprinted down the trail. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack into the back seat and jumped in, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, starting the engine and peeling out of the parking lot. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me. But the trailhead was empty, the forest still. It wasn't until I was miles away that I began to feel a sense of relief. Whatever had been out there, I was safe now. But the experience stayed with me, a reminder of how small and vulnerable we are in the face of nature's power. I haven't been back to that part of the Rockies since, and I'm not sure I ever will. The mountains are beautiful, but they're also wild and unforgiving, a place where humans are just another part of the food chain. I've always loved the outdoors, and camping has been my go-to escape whenever life gets too noisy. Last summer, I decided to take a solo trip to a remote national park in Idaho. The place wasn't well known, which was exactly what I wanted. A chance to disconnect from the world. I'd heard it had beautiful forests, clear rivers, and enough solitude to make you feel like you were the last person on Earth. I packed my gear meticulously, ensuring I had everything I'd need for a week. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food, a portable stove, and all the survival essentials. I even carried a satellite phone just in case. The drive to the park was uneventful, with the landscape gradually shifting from small towns to endless stretches of trees and mountains. By the time I arrived, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest. I parked my car at the edge of a designated lot and double-checked my map. My plan was to hike about 10 miles into the wilderness, far enough to avoid any other campers but close enough to return to the car within a day if necessary. The trail started wide and well-marked, winding through thick clusters of pine trees. The scent of the forest was intoxicating, and the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt path was oddly soothing. As I went deeper, the trail became narrower, and the signs of civilization faded away. Occasionally, I'd hear birds chirping or the rustle of leaves as squirrels darted through the underbrush. It was perfect. I felt free, completely alone, and at peace. I reached my intended campsite just before sunset. It was a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by towering pines. The spot felt secluded, with no signs of other campers for miles. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal of dehydrated chili, and sat by the creek, listening to the water flow as the sky turned from orange to deep blue. By the time the stars appeared, I was ready to call it a night. Crawling into my tent, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what I'd come for: silence, solitude, and nature. The first night was uneventful. I woke up to the sound of birds and the gentle rustle of leaves. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek upstream, marveling at how clear the water was. Small fish darted between rocks, and the occasional frog jumped into the water as I approached. I spent the day wandering, taking in the sights and snapping photos. By late afternoon, I was back at camp, tired but happy. I cooked another simple meal, watched the sunset, and went to bed early. Things started to feel strange on the second night. I woke up sometime after midnight, disoriented. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but then I realized I was wide awake. The forest was eerily silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, nothing. It was as if the entire world had paused. I lay there, straining my ears, but the silence was absolute. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the way the forest got at night, and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something odd. Around my campsite, there were small disturbances in the dirt, as if something had been moving around during the night. They weren't footprints, more like drag marks. I stared at them for a while, trying to figure out what could have caused them. A deer, maybe, or a bear. But there were no claw marks, no hoof prints, just these strange, shallow grooves. I decided not to overthink it. I'd come out here for peace, not to let my imagination run wild. I spent the day hiking further upstream, following the creek to a series of small waterfalls. The beauty of the place distracted me for a while, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the image of those marks. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was dipping low, and the forest was starting to take on that hushed, twilight feel. I made dinner and tried to relax, but my usual sense of calm was missing. Something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint sounds of the forest. The silence from the night before hadn't returned, but the usual comforting noises of nature now felt unsettling. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves seemed amplified, like they were coming from just outside my tent. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone out here. What could possibly be lurking in the woods? I must have drifted off eventually, but I woke up again sometime in the early morning. This time, it wasn't silence that woke me, but a distinct noise, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. My heart started racing. I lay completely still, listening. The sound came in short bursts, pausing for a few seconds before starting again. It was close, too close. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, shining the beam around the inside of my tent. Nothing. The sound had stopped, replaced by the pounding of my heart in my ears. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and shone the light outside. The beam swept over the clearing, illuminating the trees and the creek. Everything looked normal. No signs of movement, no glowing eyes reflecting the light. I sat there for a while, my nerves on edge, before finally retreating back into the tent. Sleep was out of the question after that. The next morning, I found more of those strange drag marks around my campsite. They were more pronounced now, like whatever had made them had been circling the tent. My gut told me it was time to leave. I'd come out here for peace, but all I felt now was unease. I packed up my gear quickly, keeping an eye on the woods around me. The feeling of being watched was almost overwhelming. As I started the hike back to my car, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees closer together. Every now and then, I'd hear a faint noise, a rustle, a snap, but whenever I stopped to listen, it was gone. I tried to keep a steady pace, but my nerves were shot. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal, person, something else entirely? About halfway back to the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Along the trail, there were more drag marks, fresher than the ones at my campsite. They seemed to follow the path I was taking, as if something had been trailing me. Panic set in and I quickened my pace, almost running at times. The noises in the forest seemed to grow louder, more deliberate. I'd never felt so vulnerable in my life. When I finally reached the parking lot, I practically threw my gear into the car and jumped in. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the trailhead. For a split second, I thought I saw something move between the trees, but it was too quick to make out. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I drove away, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly they hurt. Even now, months later, I can't fully explain what happened during that trip. I've told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion, but deep down, I'm not sure. The drag marks, the noises, the feeling of being watched. It all felt too deliberate, too unnatural. I haven't been camping since, and I'm not sure if I ever will again. The forest, once my sanctuary, now feels like a place I'm not supposed to be. And maybe, just maybe, that's for the best. I've always loved camping, especially in the solitude of remote forests where you're surrounded by nothing but trees and wildlife. The peace and quiet have a way of clearing my mind. Last summer, I decided to spend a long weekend camping alone in a national forest I'd never visited before. It was known for its rugged terrain and beautiful views, and I was eager to explore. I packed my gear, loaded up my car, and drove out early on a Friday morning. The drive was uneventful, but as I neared the forest, the roads became narrower and less maintained. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to the trailhead, I hadn't seen another car for miles. That suited me fine. I wanted to be alone, away from the chaos of everyday life. The trail I chose wasn't one of the popular ones. It branched off from the main path about a mile in and led deeper into the woods. I liked the idea of being off the beaten path. I parked my car, shouldered my heavy pack, and started hiking. The weather was perfect, clear skies, warm but not too hot, with a light breeze rustling the leaves overhead. The first few miles of the trail were easy enough. The terrain was relatively flat, and the path was well defined. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, and I occasionally spotted small animals darting through the underbrush. I stopped a few times to take pictures of particularly scenic spots: a grove of tall pines, a small creek winding through moss-covered rocks, and a fallen tree that had been overtaken by mushrooms. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I had picked out on the map for my first campsite. It was a small clearing near a larger stream. The ground was level, and there was plenty of dry wood nearby for a fire. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and started a small fire. After cooking a simple meal, I sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet and the flickering light. As night fell, the forest changed. The cheerful sounds of daytime gave way to the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of something moving through the underbrush. I wasn't nervous. I'd camped alone before and was used to the sounds of the woods at night. I read for a while by the light of my headlamp before crawling into my tent and falling asleep. The next morning, I woke up early, packed up my camp, and continued deeper into the forest. The trail became rougher, and I had to navigate around fallen trees and areas where the path was overgrown. It was harder going, but I enjoyed the challenge. I felt a sense of accomplishment every time I pushed through a difficult section. Around midday, I stopped for a break at a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the valley below. The forest stretched out as far as I could see, a sea of green under a bright blue sky. I ate a quick lunch and then continued on. The trail began to climb, and by late afternoon, I was tired and ready to set up camp again. I found another good spot, this one on a ridge overlooking a small wooded valley. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for the evening. As the sun set, the shadows lengthened, and the forest grew quiet again. I felt a deep sense of peace, the kind that only comes from being far away from civilization. That night, however, something felt different. As I lay in my tent, I became aware of a faint noise just at the edge of hearing. It was a steady, rhythmic sound, like footsteps. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a bear, moving through the woods, but the sound didn't fade away like it usually would if an animal was passing through. It stayed, moving slowly but steadily, as if circling my campsite. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but there was only silence. After a few minutes, I lay back down, telling myself I was imagining things. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I packed up and continued on, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The trail became even more difficult to follow, and I had to rely on my map and compass to stay on course. I was deep in the forest now, far from any roads or other trails. I hadn't seen another person since I left the trailhead. That evening, I found a small clearing near a cluster of large boulders and set up my camp. I was more cautious this time, making sure to hang my food bag high in a tree to keep it away from bears and other animals. As I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, peering into the darkness beyond the firelight, but I saw nothing. When I finally crawled into my tent, I felt exhausted but too alert to sleep. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest. Then I heard it again, that faint, rhythmic sound. This time it was closer. My heart pounded as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The sound circled my camp, just beyond the light of the dying fire. It was definitely footsteps, slow and deliberate. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. Shining the light into the trees, I saw nothing but shadows. The footsteps stopped as soon as I moved. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the forest, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. Eventually, I climbed back into my tent, but I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing faint noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but whenever I looked, there was nothing there. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. The thought of spending another night out there made my skin crawl. I packed up quickly and started retracing my steps. The trail was even harder to follow on the way back, and I had to backtrack several times when I realized I'd taken a wrong turn. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. The forest felt oppressive, the trees crowding in around me. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't help but imagine someone, or something, watching me from the shadows. By late afternoon, I was completely turned around. The trail markers I'd been following were nowhere to be found, and my map wasn't much help. I realized I was lost. Panic set in as I tried to figure out where I'd gone wrong. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, and I knew I didn't have much daylight left. I decided to keep moving in what I thought was the right direction, hoping to find the trail again. As the light faded, I stumbled into another clearing. At first, I was relieved, thinking I'd found a good spot to camp for the night. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing was a small, makeshift shelter made of branches and leaves. It looked old, like it had been there for a long time, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. A fire pit with fresh ashes, a few empty cans, and a dirty sleeping bag were scattered around. I felt a surge of fear and unease. This wasn't a designated campsite, and whoever had been here clearly wasn't following the usual rules of camping. I didn't want to stick around to find out who it was. I turned and hurried back into the woods, moving as quickly as I could without losing my footing. As darkness fell, I knew I had no choice but to stop and set up camp. I found a spot that felt relatively safe, a small hollow between two large rocks, and set up my tent. I didn't bother with a fire. I just crawled into my tent and sat there in the dark, clutching my knife and flashlight. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound made my heart race, and I kept imagining someone creeping up on me. When dawn finally broke, I packed up and started moving again, determined to find the trail and get out of the forest. After hours of wandering, I finally stumbled onto the main trail. Relief washed over me as I recognized the familiar path. I followed it back to the trailhead, my legs aching and my mind racing. When I reached my car, I felt like I could finally breathe again. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something, though I'll never know what. I haven't been camping alone since. I didn't start camping until I was in my late 20s. I grew up in a small town, surrounded by dense forests, but we never ventured far from home. My family wasn't the outdoorsy type, and the woods always seemed a bit intimidating. But after moving to the city and feeling the constant pressure of urban life, I started craving solitude. Camping seemed like the perfect way to escape. I'd done a few weekend trips to well-maintained campgrounds, the kind with clearly marked trails, bathrooms, and picnic tables. But this time, I wanted something different. I wanted to get away from people entirely, to immerse myself in nature and experience the kind of peace I'd read about. So, I planned a solo trip to a remote area I found online, a national forest about 6 hours away from the city. It was supposed to be quiet, untouched, and far from any major roads or towns. I spent weeks preparing. I bought a sturdy tent, a new sleeping bag, and enough food and water for 3 days. I packed a first aid kit, a map of the area, a compass, and a portable GPS. I even borrowed a satellite phone from a friend, just in case. I wanted to be careful, but I also wanted the freedom to explore without worrying too much. Everything seemed set. The drive to the forest was uneventful, but the last hour was spent on a bumpy dirt road that snaked through thick trees. I didn't see another car the entire time, which both reassured and unsettled me. When I finally reached the small parking area, I double-checked my gear, locked the car, and started hiking. The trailhead was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by towering pines. Felt like stepping into another world. The first few hours were peaceful. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I followed the trail until it faded into nothing, then used my map and compass to navigate deeper into the wilderness. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a stream, the perfect spot to set up camp. The water was crystal clear, and the ground was soft enough to pitch my tent. I felt a sense of accomplishment as I unpacked and prepared for the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew eerily quiet. I'd expected the usual nighttime noises: crickets, distant animal calls, the rustling of leaves. But instead, there was a heavy stillness. It wasn't silent, exactly, but the sounds were faint and sporadic, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in an unfamiliar place. It was natural to feel a little on edge. That night, I struggled to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear a faint crack or rustle outside the tent. I told myself it was just small animals, raccoons maybe, or squirrels. But around midnight, I heard something heavier, the distinct sound of branches snapping underfoot. It wasn't close, but it was steady, moving through the woods in a deliberate way. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to hear more. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I convinced myself it was just a deer or some other harmless animal. Still, I kept my knife close to me for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to shake off my unease. The sun was shining, and the forest looked less intimidating in the daylight. I decided to spend the day exploring the area, following the stream and enjoying the solitude. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed too quiet, too still. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. Of course, there was nothing there. Around midday, I came across an old campsite. It was little more than a fire pit surrounded by a few stones, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. The ashes were long gone, and the stones were covered in moss. There were no signs of recent activity, but the sight of it made me uneasy. I decided to move on, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the abandoned site. As the day wore on, I started to feel more and more isolated. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing denser and the light dimmer. By late afternoon, I realized I'd wandered farther than I'd intended. The stream was nowhere in sight, and I wasn't sure exactly where I was. I pulled out my map and GPS, trying to orient myself. According to the GPS, I wasn't far from my campsite, but the landscape didn't match what I remembered. The trees were different, and the ground was uneven and rocky. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction seemed wrong. The forest was a maze of identical trees, and the fading light made it harder to navigate. Panic started to set in as I realized how easy it would be to get completely lost out here. I forced myself to stay calm, focusing on the compass and map. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled back to the stream. Relief washed over me as I followed it upstream, eventually finding my campsite just as darkness fell. That night was worse than the first. I built a fire to keep myself warm and give me a sense of security, but it only made the shadows deeper. Every crack and rustle sent my heart racing, and I kept imagining shapes moving just beyond the firelight. Around midnight, I heard the sound of footsteps again, this time closer. They were slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, shining the beam into the darkness. The footsteps stopped, and I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, clutching the knife and staring into the darkness. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. The peaceful escape I'd envisioned had turned into something much darker. I packed up my gear as quickly as possible, eager to get back to the safety of my car. But as I started hiking back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear a faint rustle or crack behind me, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. The hike back took longer than expected. The trail was harder to follow, and the forest seemed different, as if it had shifted overnight. I felt disoriented, constantly checking the map and GPS to make sure I was heading in the right direction. The sounds behind me grew more frequent, and I started to feel a rising sense of dread. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. When I finally reached the parking area, I almost cried with relief. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my gear into the trunk and started the engine, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and the forest. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something watching me from the trees. But there was nothing there. It wasn't until I got home and unpacked my gear that I noticed something strange. One of the pockets on my backpack, which I'd zipped shut before leaving, was open. Inside, I found a small, hand-carved figurine of a man, no more than a few inches tall. I had no idea where it had come from or how it had gotten there. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I've thought about that trip a lot since then, replaying every detail in my mind. I've tried to come up with a rational explanation for everything that happened, but nothing makes sense. I haven't been camping since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. The woods may be beautiful, but they're also vast and unknowable, and sometimes it's better to leave them undisturbed. It was early autumn when I decided to go camping in the remote part of the forest. The air had that crisp, clean quality that only comes during this time of year, and the leaves were beginning to turn brilliant shades of red and gold. I had taken a week off from work, packed my gear, and driven to a state forest that I had researched extensively. This place was known for its rugged trails and untouched wilderness, exactly what I was looking for. I wanted solitude, a break from the monotony of daily life, and maybe a little adventure. The parking lot at the trailhead was nearly empty when I arrived, which I took as a good sign. I double-checked my pack to make sure I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, a map, and my trusty multi-tool. After locking up my car, I shouldered my pack and started down the trail. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound through dense woods, occasionally opening up to reveal stunning views of the rolling hills below. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional chirp of a bird. It felt peaceful, exactly what I needed. By mid-afternoon, I reached the spot I had marked on the map as my intended campsite. It was a small clearing near a creek, secluded but not too far off the trail. The ground was level, and there was a natural fire ring made of stones, likely left by previous campers. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and collected some firewood. The creek provided a soothing background noise, a gentle burbling that blended perfectly with the rustling leaves. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal of instant noodles and jerky. The warmth of the flames and the soft glow they cast on the surrounding trees made the forest feel less imposing. I sat there for a while, staring into the fire and letting my mind wander. It was only when the fire began to die down that I realized how dark it had gotten. The stars were out in full force, but their light barely penetrated the thick canopy above. I climbed into my tent, zipped up the door, and settled into my sleeping bag. The forest was alive with nocturnal sounds: crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was comforting, in a way, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone out here. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. I lay still, listening intently. The forest sounds were still there, but they seemed muted, almost as if something larger was moving nearby. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon rummaging around. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, and the creek's gentle burble was the only sound I could hear. I scanned the clearing but saw nothing unusual. Satisfied that it was just my imagination, I zipped the tent back up and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I woke early, feeling more refreshed than I expected. I made some coffee, packed up my gear, and decided to explore a bit further into the forest. The map showed another clearing about 2 miles away that seemed like a good place to check out. The trail was less defined here, more of a suggestion than a path, but I had my compass and was confident in my navigation skills. The deeper I went, the more remote the forest felt. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to create a tunnel-like effect. The underbrush was thicker here, making progress slower. Occasionally, I had to stop and consult my map to make sure I was still on course. It was during one of these pauses that I noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the wind rustling the leaves. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I pressed on, though the uneasy feeling from the night before began to creep back in. About an hour later, I reached the clearing. It wasn't what I had expected. The grass was overgrown, and there were no signs that anyone had camped here in a long time. In the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered cabin. It wasn't marked on the map, and its presence felt out of place. The structure was small, with a sagging roof and walls that were gray with age. A single window, its glass long gone, stared out like a dark, empty eye. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as I pushed it open. The interior was bare, just a single room with a dirt floor. Broken furniture lay scattered around, and a rusty wood stove stood in one corner. The place smelled of damp wood and decay. As I looked around, I noticed strange marks on the walls. They were scratches, deep and deliberate, forming patterns that didn't make any sense to me. My unease grew, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the marks were from animals or some long-forgotten occupant. I didn't stay long. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, oppressive, and I was eager to get back to the safety of my campsite. As I stepped outside, I felt a sudden chill, even though the day was still warm. The forest around the clearing seemed darker, the shadows deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hike back to my campsite felt longer than it should have. Every crackle of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already low in the sky. I hurried to rebuild my fire, its light and warmth a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow more menacing. Around midnight, I heard it again, the sound of something moving just outside my tent. This time it was closer, deliberate. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to hear more. Then came the sound of heavy breathing, low and guttural. It wasn't an animal I recognized. I gripped my multi-tool tightly, ready to defend myself if necessary. The breathing stopped, but the tension didn't. I waited, every muscle in my body taut. Minutes passed, then hours, but nothing else happened. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent, exhausted but relieved to see the daylight. The clearing looked untouched, as if the night's terror had been a bad dream. But I knew better. Something had been out there. I decided to cut my trip short. As much as I loved the wilderness, the events of the past 2 nights had shaken me. I packed up my gear and started back toward the trailhead. The hike out was uneventful, but the feeling of being watched never left me. When I finally reached my car, I felt an immense wave of relief. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin and the strange marks on its walls. I've been camping countless times before and have always felt at home in the woods, but this trip was different. Something was out there, something I can't explain. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I'm not sure I ever will. I've always enjoyed camping. There's something peaceful about being out in nature, away from the noise and busyness of the world. I'd done it plenty of times, always packing carefully and sticking to well-marked trails. But the trip I took last summer taught me how quickly things can go wrong, even when you think you've prepared for everything. The plan was simple: a solo camping trip to a remote area in a national forest. I'd picked a spot I'd read about online, one that was supposed to be beautiful but not too crowded. It was about a 5-mile hike from the parking lot to the campsite, which felt like just the right amount of challenge. I'd packed enough food for 3 days, a good tent, a sleeping bag rated for colder temperatures, and all the usual supplies: a first aid kit, extra clothes, a map, a compass, and plenty of water. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. It was early morning, and the sun was just starting to rise, casting a golden light over the trees. I parked my car in the small lot, shouldered my backpack, and started walking. The trail was well marked, just as I'd expected, and the weather was perfect. Birds were chirping, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. I felt good, excited to be out here, alone with my thoughts and the sounds of the forest. The hike to the campsite took about 2 hours. The trail wound through dense woods, crossing a few small streams and climbing gradually uphill. When I reached the site, I was pleased to find it just as described: a flat clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a fire pit already built by previous campers. There was even a small stream nearby for water. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area. As evening fell, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal. Sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the sounds of the forest, I felt completely at peace. I hadn't seen another person since I left the parking lot, and I liked it that way. The solitude was refreshing. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early the next morning, feeling rested and ready to explore more of the forest. I packed a small day bag with snacks, water, and a map, then set off on a trail that looped around the area. It was a beautiful hike, with plenty of scenic views and interesting spots to stop and rest. I didn't rush, taking my time to enjoy the surroundings. It was late afternoon by the time I got back to the campsite. I was tired but satisfied with the day. After another simple meal and some time by the fire, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep quickly. I don't know what woke me up that night. It was still dark, and for a moment, I just lay there, listening. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was nothing and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The kind of feeling you get when you're being watched. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint light over the clearing. Everything looked normal. I told myself I was just being paranoid and lay back down, but I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. About 20 feet from my tent, in the dirt near the edge of the clearing, were footprints. They were larger than mine, and they hadn't been there the day before. I'd walked all around the campsite when I arrived, and I would have noticed them. Someone had been here during the night. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just another hiker passing through, I thought. Maybe they'd seen my fire and decided not to bother me. But the thought didn't sit well with me. Why would someone walk through my campsite in the middle of the night and not say anything? And why hadn't I heard them? I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I went for another hike, staying closer to the campsite this time, and kept telling myself it was nothing. But I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. When I got back to the campsite that evening, I checked the area thoroughly. There were no new prints and nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't relax. That night, I didn't sleep well at all. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept thinking about those footprints. I'd left my bear spray and a sturdy camping knife within reach, just in case. Hours seemed to crawl by, and I kept glancing at my watch, willing the night to end. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard it. A soft sound, like footsteps, coming from the direction of the stream. They were slow and deliberate, not the kind of noise an animal would make. My heart pounded as I lay there, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment, there was silence. Then I heard them again, closer this time. I grabbed the bear spray and knife, my hands shaking. I didn't want to call out or make any noise that might give away my exact location. The footsteps moved around the edge of the clearing, circling my tent. I could hear them crunching softly on the forest floor. Then they stopped just outside the tent. I held my breath, clutching the bear spray tightly. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then, without a sound, they moved away, the footsteps fading into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed awake, listening, every muscle in my body tense. When the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't bother with breakfast or breaking down the fire pit properly. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the parking lot felt like it took forever. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail was empty, and I made it back to my car without incident. Driving away from the forest, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps or the feeling of being watched in the dark. Since then, I've been more cautious about camping, especially alone. I still love the outdoors, but that experience changed me. It reminded me that no matter how prepared you think you are, the wilderness can be unpredictable. And sometimes, the scariest thing out there isn't the wildlife, it's other people. I've always enjoyed camping. Being in the wilderness, away from the noise of the city, always felt like a reset for my mind. Last summer, I decided to go solo camping for the first time. I wanted to challenge myself to see if I could manage without any help. It wasn't my first camping trip, but it was my first time alone. I picked a spot I'd read about online, a remote area in the northern woods. It was supposed to be peaceful, with a lake nearby and plenty of trails to explore. I left early in the morning, driving 4 hours to reach the trailhead. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, which I took as a good sign. After all, the whole point was to get away from people. I double-checked my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, flashlight, and a small camp stove. Everything was there. I also carried a map of the area and a compass, even though I had a GPS app on my phone. I'd read enough stories about phones dying at the worst possible moment to know better than to rely on it completely. The hike to my chosen campsite was about 5 miles. The trail wound through dense forest, with towering pine trees blocking much of the sunlight. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as I walked. The solitude was refreshing but also a little unnerving. Every snap of a twig made me glance over my shoulder, even though I knew it was probably just a squirrel or a bird. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached the spot I'd marked on my map. It was perfect, A small clearing surrounded by trees, with a view of the lake just a short walk away. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, making sure the ground was flat and free of rocks. Then I unpacked my gear, laying everything out neatly. By the time I finished, it was late afternoon. The sun was still high, but I knew it would start to set soon. I spent the next hour gathering firewood. There was plenty of dry wood scattered around, and I piled it near the fire pit someone had built before me. As the sun dipped lower, I lit the fire and started cooking dinner. It was just a simple meal of instant noodles and canned beans, but out here it tasted amazing. I sat by the fire, eating and watching the flames dance. The sky turned shades of orange and pink before fading to deep blue. Stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was filled with them. It was beautiful, the kind of view you can't get in the city. By the time I finished eating, it was fully dark. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I felt a sense of peace, sitting there alone with the wilderness around me. But as the night grew quieter, that peace turned to unease. The sounds of the forest, which had been comforting during the day, now felt ominous. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed louder in the darkness. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. I decided to turn in early, hoping that sleep would calm my nerves. I doused the fire, making sure it was completely out, and crawled into my tent. Inside, it was warm and cozy, my sleeping bag providing a cocoon of comfort. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds outside. The wind rustled through the trees, and I could hear the faint lapping of water against the shore. It was soothing at first, but then I started hearing other noises. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was faint, but it was there. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound would come and go, moving closer and then farther away. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up. It was still dark, but something had startled me. I lay there, heart pounding, trying to figure out what it was. Then I heard it again, a sharp, distinct snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. This time it was closer, much closer. My mind raced, going over every possibility. An animal? Person? My hand instinctively went to the small knife I'd brought, which was lying next to me in the tent. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving around the clearing. Whoever or whatever, it seemed to be circling my campsite. I could hear them stop and start, pausing as if to listen. My breathing was shallow, and I tried to make as little noise as possible. Every instinct in me screamed to stay quiet and hidden. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded away. I lay there, frozen, unsure if it was safe to move. The forest was silent again, but my mind was racing. Should I pack up and leave? But where would I go in the middle of the night? The thought of hiking through the dark, with whatever was out there possibly following me, was terrifying. I decided to stay put, reasoning that the tent at least provided some semblance of safety. I clutched my knife and stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening for any sign of movement. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The forest, which had felt so threatening at night, seemed almost welcoming in the daylight. I cautiously unzipped my tent and stepped outside, scanning the clearing for any signs of what had been there. There were no tracks, no disturbed ground, nothing to indicate anyone had been there. But I knew what I'd heard. I spent the morning debating whether to stay or leave. Part of me wanted to pack up and head back to the car, but another part of me didn't want to let fear ruin the trip. I decided to stay, convincing myself that it had probably just been an animal after all. To shake off the unease, I spent the day exploring the trails around the lake. The scenery was stunning, with sunlight filtering through the trees and sparkling on the water. I even saw a couple of other hikers in the distance, which made me feel a little less isolated. By the time I returned to camp, I was feeling better. I cooked another simple meal and sat by the fire as the sun set. The events of the previous night seemed almost like a bad dream, but as darkness fell, the unease crept back in. I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I kept the fire going longer this time, hoping it would deter anything from coming too close. When I finally went to bed, I made sure my knife was within easy reach. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the sounds outside. For a while it was quiet. Then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the clearing. My heart pounded as I gripped the knife tightly. This time, they were even closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves just outside my tent. Whoever it was stopped right next to me. I held my breath, terrified they would try to come inside. But they didn't. After a few minutes, the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun finally rose, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt oppressive, the trees seeming to close in around me. I hiked back to the car without stopping, my heart racing the entire way. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief. There were a few other cars there now, and the sight of them was oddly comforting. I loaded my gear into the trunk and got into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, months later, I can't explain what happened. Maybe it was just an animal and my mind turned it into something more. Or maybe it was a person, someone who enjoyed scaring campers. Either way, it's an experience I won't forget. I haven't been camping since. Camping had always been my way of disconnecting. After months of staring at screens and dealing with endless meetings, the thought of sitting by a crackling fire, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of nature, sounded like the perfect escape. So when I had a free weekend, I packed up my gear, threw it in the back of my car, and headed to a remote spot I'd heard about online. It was supposed to be off the beaten path, away from the crowds, just the way I liked it. The drive there was uneventful, but the further I got from civilization, the more I felt a strange sense of isolation. The road narrowed into a dirt trail, flanked by towering pines and dense underbrush. My GPS lost signal about 10 miles back, but I had written down directions and felt confident I could navigate. After all, this wasn't my first solo trip. I reached the clearing just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The site was perfect, a flat patch of ground surrounded by thick woods, with a small stream nearby for water. I set up my tent quickly, laid out my sleeping bag, and got a fire going. The warmth of the flames and the soft hum of the forest around me eased any lingering tension. As night fell, I cooked a simple meal, ate in silence, and stared up at the stars. It was the kind of quiet that you don't get in the city, the kind that makes you feel like the world has stopped moving. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. I zipped up my tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and let the natural lullabies carry me to sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was still buzzing with life, but something felt off. I lay still, listening. That's when I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dried leaves. My heart began to race. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps sounded deliberate, spaced out, like someone trying to move quietly. I stayed frozen, straining to hear more. The sound grew closer, then stopped entirely. The silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, my ears searching for any hint of movement. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination or some nocturnal animal passing through. Still, it took a long time to fall back asleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Everything seemed normal. The forest was peaceful, bathed in golden sunlight. I shook off the unease from the night before, chalking it up to paranoia. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the stream for a while, marveling at how untouched everything felt. No trash, no signs of other campers. It was like I had the whole forest to myself. As I walked, I came across a small pile of rocks stacked in a pyramid shape. It looked intentional, not something nature would do. I figured it was left by another camper and didn't think much of it. Still, I couldn't shake the odd feeling it gave me. I kept walking, making a mental note of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. By the time I got back to camp, it was late afternoon. I spent the rest of the day gathering firewood, reading a book, and enjoying the solitude. As the sun dipped low, I started another fire and cooked dinner. The woods felt different as night fell, the shadows longer and the noises sharper. I told myself I was overthinking again and tried to relax. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. This time, they were closer, circling the campsite. My throat went dry as I listened. Whoever or whatever it wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. The steps were heavy, purposeful. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by my side and flicked it on, aiming the beam toward the noise. The footsteps stopped immediately. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the trees, but the light revealed nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight and a small camping knife. The footsteps didn't return, but the sense of being watched never left. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I told myself I was being silly, that I'd probably scared off a curious animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to leave. On the hike back to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The woods felt oppressive, like they were closing in on me. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart jump. When I finally reached the dirt road where I'd parked, I felt a wave of relief. But that relief was short-lived. My car had been tampered with. The tires were slashed, and the windows had been smeared with mud. Panic set in as I realized I was miles from the nearest town, with no cell service and no way to drive out. I searched the area, yelling to see if anyone would respond, but the woods swallowed my voice. Whoever had done this was long gone, or worse, still watching. I decided my best option was to follow the road back on foot. It would take hours, but I'd rather be moving than sitting by my disabled car, waiting for help that might not come. I grabbed my backpack, made sure I had water and some snacks, and started walking. The road felt endless. The sun climbed higher, but the forest remained eerily quiet. Around midday, I found another pile of rocks stacked in that same pyramid shape I'd seen near my campsite. This one was placed in the middle of the road, as if to block my path. My stomach churned, but I stepped around it and kept going. As the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I'd stop occasionally, pretending to adjust my pack, and listen. Each time, I thought I heard faint rustling behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. The isolation was getting to me, making every shadow and sound feel like a threat. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted. I hadn't seen another person or car all day. Just as I was starting to wonder if I'd have to spend another night in the woods, I spotted a small cabin off to the side of the road. It looked abandoned, the windows boarded up and the roof sagging in places, but it was shelter. I approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was inside. When there was no response, I pushed the door open. The interior was as run down as the outside, with broken furniture and a thick layer of dust covering everything. Still, it felt safer than being out in the open. I barricaded the door as best as I could and settled in for the night. I didn't light a fire, not wanting to draw attention. Instead, I ate a granola bar in the dark and tried to stay alert. The cabin creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, but I told myself it was just the age of the structure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time right outside the cabin. My stomach dropped as the steps circled the building, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was stopped at the door, and I heard the faintest tap, tap, tap like fingers drumming on the wood. I held my breath, clutching my knife, and prayed they would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I peeked out the window. The area was empty, no sign of anyone. I gathered my things and left the cabin as quickly as I could. The walk back to town was grueling, but I eventually made it. When I finally reached a gas station and saw other people, I nearly broke down. I told the clerk my story, and they called the local sheriff. I filed a report, but without any real evidence or witnesses, there wasn't much they could do. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. I haven't been camping since. I had always loved the idea of camping alone in the wilderness. It was my way of disconnecting from the world and finding some peace. There was something about being surrounded by nature. The sounds of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the distant hum of a river that made me feel alive. This time, I chose a spot deep in the national forest, far from any established campgrounds. I wanted the experience to be as raw and unfiltered as possible. I arrived at the trailhead in the early afternoon. The weather was perfect for late spring, cool enough to keep the bugs away but warm enough to be comfortable in a light jacket. I had packed my usual gear: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and my trusty multi-tool. I also brought a portable GPS, even though I had a paper map as my main guide. I didn't plan on getting lost, but you never know. The trail started off easy. The first few miles were well-marked and relatively flat. As I ventured deeper, the path became less defined. I had to rely on my map and compass to keep on track. The forest grew denser, and the sounds of civilization faded until there was nothing but the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a bird. After about 5 hours of hiking, I found a small clearing near a creek. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was soft but not soggy, and the creek provided fresh water. I pitched my tent, set up a small fire pit, and gathered some dry wood from the surrounding area. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal of dehydrated noodles, and watched the stars come out. It was so quiet that I could hear the creek babbling in the background. I felt a sense of peace that I rarely experienced in my day-to-day life. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I fell asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I woke up early. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with activity. Birds chirped, and squirrels darted through the underbrush. I decided to spend the day exploring the area around my campsite. I left most of my gear behind, carrying only my map, a bottle of water, and a small snack. I followed the creek upstream for a while, climbing over rocks and ducking under low-hanging branches. The terrain became more rugged as I went, but I didn't mind. It was exhilarating to navigate the wild, untouched landscape. I came across a small waterfall spilling into a pool of crystal-clear water. The sight was so picturesque that I spent nearly an hour there, just soaking in the beauty. By the time I started heading back to camp, the sun was high in the sky. I took a slightly different route on the way back, cutting through a section of the forest that looked less traveled. That's when I noticed something odd. The trees in this area were scarred. Deep gouges ran up their trunks, as if something had raked them with enormous claws. At first, I thought it might be the work of a bear, but the marks were too high up, and they didn't resemble claw marks I had seen before. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was probably just some natural phenomenon I didn't understand. When I got back to camp, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The marks on the trees had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. To distract myself, I gathered more firewood and spent some time reinforcing my fire pit. As the sun began to set, I prepared another simple meal and tried to focus on the calming sounds of the forest. That night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, a distant rustling that could have been the wind. But as I lay there listening, it grew louder. It sounded like something moving through the underbrush, circling my campsite. My heart began to race. I grabbed my flashlight and my multi-tool, which was the closest thing I had to a weapon. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim red glow over the campsite. I swept the flashlight beam around, scanning the trees. The noise stopped. The forest was eerily silent, as if it were holding its breath. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining my ears for any sign of movement. When nothing happened, I convinced myself it had been an animal passing through and crawled back into my tent. The next day, I decided to stay closer to camp. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming at first, now felt oppressive. The trees loomed larger, and every sound seemed amplified. I spent the day gathering more firewood than I needed and triple-checking my map to make sure I knew the way back to the trailhead. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The gouges I had seen on the trees during my hike, there were similar marks on a tree just a few yards from my campsite. I was sure they hadn't been there the day before. It felt like a message, though I couldn't imagine what it meant or who or what had left it. I barely slept that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a noise that jolted me awake. The rustling in the underbrush returned, louder this time and more deliberate. It wasn't the random scurrying of a small animal. It was measured, almost like footsteps. I gripped my multi-tool tightly and stared at the tent ceiling, waiting for morning. When dawn finally came, I made the decision to cut my trip short. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started back toward the trailhead. The hike out was grueling. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I felt like I was being watched, though I never saw anyone or anything. About halfway back, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. There was a pile of rocks in the middle of the trail. It wasn't large, but it was deliberate, like a cairn. The strange part was that it hadn't been there on my way in. Someone had placed it there while I was in the forest. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I didn't stop to investigate. I stepped around the pile and kept moving, my pace quickening with each step. The closer I got to the trailhead, the more desperate I felt to leave. When I finally saw the parking lot through the trees, I almost cried with relief. As I reached my car, I turned back for one last look at the trail. The forest was still and silent, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. It looked peaceful, almost inviting, but I knew better. Something out there had been watching me, tracking me, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. I never did figure out what those marks on the trees were or who had placed the rocks on the trail. But one thing is certain: I'll never camp alone in the wilderness again.